We'll call our meeting to order and welcome everybody to the 89th meeting of the Standing Committee on Health. Today we're starting a new study on Bill S5, an act to amend the Tobacco Act and the Non-Smokers Health Act, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. As witnesses today, it looks like they brought lots of homework for us. We have the Physicians for a Smoke-Free Canada, Neil E. Collishaw, Research Director, welcome. And we have the Canadian Cancer Society, Rob Cunningham, Senior Policy Analyst, welcome back. And we have from Heart and Stroke Foundation, Lesley James, Senior Manager, Health Policy. And as an individual, we have Dr. Gaston Ostiguy, Chest Physician, Associate Professor and Past Director of Smoking Cessation Clinic, McGill University. So now we'll ask each of you to make an opening statement of no more than 10 minutes, and then we'll go to questions, and we'll start with Physicians for a Smoke-Free Canada. Mr. Collishaw, fire away.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Et je vous remercie, honorable député.
I thank you very much, honorable members, for your invitation to present our views on Bill S5, the Tobacco Act and Non-Smokers Health Act. I'm Director of Research for Doctors for Smoke-Free Canada. I'm not a doctor myself, but I've been working for over 35 years on tobacco control and for Health Canada in the 90s and for the World Health Organization, WHO, in 96.
What is currently a gray market for vaping products. It will give some clarifications which facilitate the introduction of plain packaging and will make a small number of other important advances for tobacco control. Sadly, however, the bill as currently drafted contains unnecessary risks to public health. If these flaws are not corrected, we predict that the bill will, on balance, create more problems than it solves. The fundamental flaw in the bill is that it opens the door too wide for the promotion of vaping products. One consequence of legalizing vaping products is that will it invite big tobacco companies into the Canadian market with new vaping products. They do not participate now in the gray market. Royal assent on this bill will be the starting gun for the race to sell as many of these products as they can, using every marketing tool that this law will hand them. The bill hands them too many such tools. As currently drafted, it will allow them to advertise on television, radio, billboards, in retail outlets, social media, direct mail, text messaging, contests, and giveaways. Once again, girls in skimpy outfits could be sent into bars to offer samples to patrons. We have seen the same companies use these same tools to recruit and addict previous generations to nicotine. Our recommendation for minimizing this risk is simple. Restrict advertising for vaping products the same way that it is restricted for tobacco, which you will remember from your review of C45 is also the same type of restrictions that are in place for cannabis. Permit only information and brand advertising and allow it only in a very few places. Even if the marketing rules are the same, vaping products would still enjoy a marketplace advantage over tobacco products, and they will be sold in branded packages with lesser health warnings and without taxes. And we are not alone in making this recommendation. Most major health organizations also suggest that vaping products be subject to similar restrictions. In response to these concerns, the Senate adopted the amendments proposed by the Health Department to give the government regulatory authority to curb advertising of vaping products in case things went wrong. And a few months later, Health Canada issued a consultation paper on the types of regulations it was considering. And these were a throwback. They were very similar to those that the tobacco industry used to govern itself in place for cigarettes in the 1960s and 1970s. Restricting television advertising to certain times of day, billboards to certain distances from schools is not good enough, and we know this from bitter experience. and no one should be encouraged to try a consumer product that has a better than 30 chance of addicting them to lifelong use. Regulations cannot put the advertising genie back in the bottle. We need to restrict advertising for vaping products now, not later, and we need to do it strongly, not weakly. If this bill passes as currently drafted, Canada will be virtually alone in allowing such liberalized rules for promoting vaping products. Most OECD countries that allow vaping products to be sold apply similar advertising restrictions to those that exist for tobacco. Only the USA allows largely unrestricted advertising for vaping products. And what has this meant for young Americans? Well, I think the title of the December 2016 press release from the U.S. Surgeon General is the answer. Surgeon General reports youth and young adult e-cigarette use poses a public health threat. Now I turn to another flaw in Bill S5, one that could be described as a serious omission. While opening the door to vaping products and their advertising, Bill S5 fails to start closing the other, to tobacco products. Bill S5 legalizes vaping products in the hope that they will offer some reduction from the harm that tobacco causes. It's a nice hope, and I hope it comes true, but it's still only a hope. To guarantee that harm will be reduced, we need a plan to get rid of the conventional cigarette. And now, a few months ago, the U.S. pushed forward with its vision of how to ensure that the benefits of less harmful forms of nicotine use were accompanied by a reduction in the use of the most harmful forms. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration announced a comprehensive harm reduction framework in July of 2017, in which they plan to reduce the amount of nicotine in conventional cigarettes as a way of shifting smokers to less harmful forms. Now, because of particularities of American law and regulation, the FDA is constrained on how it can regulate cigarettes, and they have chosen nicotine reduction because basically the law doesn't allow them to have any other options. But in Canada, we do. You do, as legislators. And we can follow and improve on the American lead by creating a harm reduction framework that aims to reduce the supply and demand for cigarettes by using a range of approaches. These might include cap and trade programs, financial incentives, performance requirements, and other modern regulatory tools. The government has set a goal of achieving less than 5% tobacco use prevalence by 2035. Less than 5 by 35. But so far, it seems to be less of a plan and more of just a slogan. However, there is now an opportunity through Bill S5 to establish a harm reduction framework that will ensure that legalizing vaping helps reduce smoking. And here are some key changes that we are proposing in very much summary form. Expand the purpose of the Act to include reducing the burden of disease, preventing addiction to nicotine, and achieving the minister's goal of less than 5 by 35. Expand the scope of the Act once again to establish regulatory authority over new heat-not-burn products, as well as other new tobacco products that may be introduced in the future, and impose new requirements and obligations on the tobacco industry. Now, we have prepared detailed suggestions for how these changes could be introduced during clause-by-clause review of the bill, and I will be happy to share our suggestions with you later on. This committee can greatly assist in achieving the goal of less than 5 by 35. Don't allow S5 to be passed without the safeguards needed to protect young people and others from tobacco and nicotine industry marketing. Make sure that S5 is a step towards ending the sale of combustible tobacco products and not a way to recruit future smokers. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you very much. And now we go to the Canadian Cancer Society. Mr. Cunningham.
Chair, committee members, my name is Rob Cunningham, lawyer and senior policy analyst for the Canadian Cancer Society. Merci pour l'opportunité de témoigner aujourd'hui.
For the opportunity to appear today.
Minister Petty Taylor for their support in advancing tobacco control. We also acknowledge all parties in supporting Bill S5 at second reading and the role that all parties over decades have done to contribute to advancing tobacco control in Canada. We support Bill S5 and have a number of recommended amendments to improve the bill. First, I'll speak to plain and standardized packaging. This is a key tobacco control measure, including to protect youth. Canada will join the 8 countries that have finalized plain packaging requirements: Australia, United Kingdom, France, Ireland, Norway, New Zealand, Hungary, and Slovenia, and the many more in progress. This binder includes an international overview of where things are at, distributed to you. Plain packaging advances several objectives: reducing tobacco product appeal, curbing package deception, ending promotional aspects of packaging, improving health warning effectiveness, and reducing tobacco use. The package is the most important type of tobacco advertising that remains in Canada today. Tobacco is addictive and lethal and should not be sold in packages to be made more attractive, period. Peel Tobacco stated there is no evidence to support plain packaging. In fact, the evidence is overwhelming. Beside me is an extensive 13-volume evidentiary compilation submitted to this committee, available for your review and consideration. The compilation contains abundant studies worldwide that provide compelling evidence that plain packaging would be effective. There are more than 150 studies and reports and other evidentiary items specifically on package promotion and plain packaging, not to mention a vast number on package warnings and other related packaging aspects. Distributed to you separately is a table of contents. Of course, plain packaging would be effective. Why else would the tobacco industry be so opposed? Implementation of plain packaging in Australia has been a success, but the tobacco industry claims that plain packaging in Australia has been a failure. Claims echoed by Sinclair Davidson, who will testify later today. Mr. Davidson is a senior research fellow with the Australia's Institute of Public Affairs, an organization that has received tobacco industry funding. The real benefit of plain packaging will be seen over 20 years, but the initial years are already encouraging. And if I can invite members of the committee to turn to tab 4 in this binder, and you see a graph with respect to the trends in smoking prevalence in Australia.
Just point of order, I don't have the binder. Do I? Sorry, Mr. Chair, could you stop the clock for Mr. Cunningham so he doesn't lose time? I'll get the binders. Thank you.
So in tab 4, you see the graph of the trend in smoking prevalence in Australia. Plain packaging was implemented in 2012, and you see a decline in smoking prevalence after. It's not the case that smoking declines have stalled. If we turn to the next page, this is for 18 to 19-year-olds. And again, we see a decline in smoking prevalence. This is the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. The sample size for youth is smaller, but the next page has a much bigger sample size, current smoking 16 to 17-year-olds in Australia, and there's a decline. And when smoking rates get low, even a couple of percentage points is very, very important in terms of potential health impact. There are other graphs that follow different sample size, but also to the extent that they're reliable, and there's caution, but they're encouraging. In France, the tobacco industry points to a decline in cigarette sales of 0.7% in the 12 months following implementation of plain packaging on January 1st, 2017, to say that plain packaging is not working. However, there was also a decline of 5.1% in roll-your-own tobacco, an important category in France. When considering population growth, per capita declines are about 2% and 6%. And those numbers do not take into account inventory movements and changes in contraband levels, which can distort things. Just prior to implementation, retailers would have decreased their purchases to get rid of old stock and not to be stuck with things that would be done. After January 1st, they had to replenish their inventory. So that distorts things. The French government has supported strongly plain packaging, and in 2015 even hosted a 10-country ministerial meeting to promote plain packaging with ministers of health from other governments. One claim that has been raised is that plain packaging will take more time for a store employee to retrieve a package for a customer. This has not been the case in Australia, where many retailers simply place brands in alphabetical order. Studies in Australia found that there was actually a decrease in the time it took to retrieve a package. Regarding contraband, industry claims should be disregarded as without merit for numerous reasons. Tab 3 of the binder responds to their claims. Keep in mind that the 3 major tobacco companies in Canada in 2008-2010 were convicted of contraband and paid fines and civil settlements of $1.7 billion. The only reports cited to support the claim that plain packaging increases contraband are funded by the tobacco industry. KPMG, author of various reports, was forced to take the unusual step of writing to the British Health Minister, denying that its report indicated that plain packaging increased contraband, as the industry had cited. The report actually found no counterfeit products, none, packaged for the Australian market. And the total volume of all contraband in 2016 of 2.3 million kilograms was less than the 2.4 million kilograms in 2010, prior to plain packaging. Imperial Tobacco argues that taking the brand name and logo off cigarettes will cause contraband. This is not the case. In part, companies will be allowed to place an alphanumeric indicator on cigarettes unique to each brand, as is done in Australia. But there should also be a mandatory marking, something that Ms. Gladue and other members of Parliament raised during second reading debate. Such a marking would provide an indication as to what is intended for legitimate sale in Canada and would assist in responding to contraband concerns. The best mandatory marking would be a health warning, a measure supported by research. An amendment to the bill should provide regulatory authority to allow health warnings directly on tobacco products themselves in addition to packages, just as the bill currently does for vaping products. Our recommended amendments to the bill are included at tab 1 of the binder. A further amendment should provide regulatory authority that some or all of the provisions of the Act in the future could apply to herbal products for smoking, including herbal water pipe products. Water pipe use, hookah, is on the increase among youth and needs a response. An amendment should modify the process to adopt regulations on the Tobacco Act. It should no longer be necessary to submit regulations to the House of Commons for approval. Almost no other federal legislation has such a requirement, which inhibits effective and rapid responses that are essential when dealing with an epidemic. Regarding e-cigarettes, we recognize that e-cigarettes are less harmful than conventional cigarettes, and we support the change regulatory status in Bill S5. Through Bill S5, the government is making e-cigarettes available as a less harmful product to smokers unable to quit. At the same time, the government recognizes that there are potential negative risks. Legislation is needed to deal with those potential risks, such as youth use, as well as marketing tactics that would discourage cessation or that would appeal to ex-smokers and non-smokers. Many of the bill's cigarette advertising restrictions are weak compared to other jurisdictions. An amendment should ban all lifestyle advertising. Examples could include tropical beaches, sports cars, and glasses of wine by romantic sets, examples allowed by this bill. The Canadian Vaping Association in Senate committee testimony supported a lifestyle ban. An amendment should clearly specify that the only advertising allowed is information advertising or brand preference advertising. This is reasonable. This is in fact the government's stated intent, but the intent is not reflected in the bill's current wording. Again, the Canadian Vaping Association testified it wanted advertising limited to information advertising. An amendment should further curtail sales promotions, such as e-cigarette purchases giving a chance to win a free vacation or tickets to a rock concert. Again, these are lifestyle associations. An amendment should restrict the location of permitted advertising and thus reduce youth exposure, though still permitting advertising to adult audiences. At present, there is no restriction on location whatsoever in the bill. It's weaker than tobacco and cannabis. Advertising is allowed on television, public transit, bus shelters, billboards, comic books, virtually everywhere. Other countries, such as New Zealand, which are legalizing e-cigarettes with nicotine, will ban e-cigarette advertising, allowing some at retail in a way that matches provisions for tobacco. What we have in Bill S5 has provisions that are so weak that they're comparable to the 1964 Canadian Tobacco Industry Voluntary Code. They're very weak, even when you consider proposed regulations that the government has released for consultation. Even with the proposed amendments on e-cigarette promotion, federal and provincial legislation would still allow retail displays and the provision of product information in specialty vape shops, as well as other specified locations. We urge support for Bill S5 and our proposed amendments. Bill S5 is a critical component to a renewed and strengthened federal tobacco control strategy. Before concluding, I would like to comment on the claim by Rothmans, Benson, Hedges that they want to end smoking and stop cigarette sales. This is a public relations claim. That is not believable. Why are they not supporting plain packaging for cigarettes, if that is their objective? Why are they funding convenience store associations to talk about contraband and oppose tax increases for cigarettes? Tab 5 of your binder shows the global campaign for Marlboro with lifestyle advertising, the Be Marlboro campaign. And this is not a company that's sincere in ending cigarette sales when they have advertising like that. This is a company that today, on packages of Canadian Classics, has a mountain lake scene that looks like Banff or Lake Louise. That's a lifestyle association. That's an example of why we need plain packaging. They sell Benson Hedges Super Slim cigarettes, very appealing to young girls and women. Those should be banned. We have other companies, for example, this is a company that has a marshmallows over a campfire. This is a Pall Mall. That's an association with lifestyle that is very appealing, and plain packaging would deal with that. And just a final example, because there are so many of them. This is from Rothmans, Benson, Hedges, and how they have a package of cigarettes, but with a sleeve that has advertising. So that's how they get around restrictions and bans on billboards. So it's an opportunity for us to implement plain packaging. We express our appreciation to all committees for the opportunity to appear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we go to Heart and Stroke Foundation, Ms. Lesley James.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm Lesley James, Senior Manager of Health Policy at Heart and Stroke. I'm also a doctoral researcher. It's an honor to speak to you today about Bill S5, a key piece of legislation in achieving Heart and Stroke's vision of a Canada free of commercial tobacco use. Your committee will hear from many of our Health Coalition partners and tobacco control experts on this subject. Our common agreement is that we support aspects of Bill S5 as related to plain and standardized packaging, but have significant concerns with the bill's permissiveness around wide-scale marketing of e-cigarettes. As such, we recommend amendments. Bill S5 represents an important step to strengthen tobacco control. It aims to protect the health of our children and youth from the industry tactics that target and hook young Canadians to addictive and harmful products. While S5 in its current form recognizes the power of tobacco marketing in appealing to young Canadians, it fails to protect that same vulnerable group as well as non-smokers from persuasive e-cigarette advertising. In this regard, S5 contains a fundamental flaw, and we hope to see amendments made to address this disconnect between marketing restrictions. The federal government has committed to a goal of less than 5% tobacco use by 2035. Despite efforts to reduce tobacco use in Canada, smoking rates remain unacceptably high at 17%. We support the 5% target and strongly believe that S5 is a key piece of legislation to achieve this target. Getting to 5% is important because tobacco use remains the leading cause of premature death in Canada, killing over 45,000 Canadians each year. That's 120 of us every day. Nearly 1 in 5 deaths in Canada can be attributed to tobacco use. We have much work ahead of us, especially as it relates to young Canadians. Smoking rates are greatest among young adults aged 20 to 24 at 18.5%. And sadly, almost 10% of 15 to 19-year-olds in Canada identify as current smokers. We know that most smokers start as teenagers, but 20% of Canadians try their first cigarette as young adults. So how do we address this issue and reduce tobacco use among all Canadians with particular focus on youth and young adults? The answer is plain and simple. Heart and Stroke strongly encourages and supports the adoption and expedited implementation of plain and standardized tobacco packaging. Our organization has been urging for the adoption of this policy measure for decades, and I'd like to show you why it's so important. I have examples of packs sold in Canada. This is a pack targeted towards young men. We call it a hipster pack. It's trendy, kind of rustic looking. These ones are targeted towards young females. They're meant with cosmetic packages. My lipstick that I bought last week looks just like this. And you can see that the product inside is equally as appealing as the outside. It's appealing and glamorous. As a woman who understands and recognizes that these products shrewdly appeal to gender-specific beauty norms and ideals, I want to emphasize that these gender-oriented tactics preying upon young and vulnerable women are offensive, demeaning, and need to be stopped. The use of the word slim and vogue, along with the delicate but sparkly cigarette, also demonstrate that the product itself should be mandated to be unappealing. This would entail banning slim cigarettes and an opportunity to use the product itself for health messages. As such, we ask for an amendment in this bill providing the regulatory authority to require health messaging on the product itself. This is already the case for e-cigarettes in this bill. Messages like "tobacco kills" or the promotion of cessation programs on each cigarette would be highly effective in dissuading use and increasing quit attempts. Plain packaging has been endorsed by the World Health Organization and adopted in many countries. Evidence indicates it has a variety of benefits, including accelerated declines in tobacco use, curbing deceptive marketing messages, increasing the visibility and effectiveness of health warnings, reducing the appeal of tobacco among youth, and increasing smoking cessation attempts. After the policy's implementation in Australia, positive image associations across all tobacco brands fell, and the greatest decline was seen among adolescent smokers. Concerns about contraband in relation to plain packaging are inaccurate, overstated, and exaggerated by the tobacco industry. Contraband concerns are often used as an industry narrative to stall tobacco control policies. We applaud all parliamentarians for forging ahead with plain packaging and recognizing the tactics used by the tobacco industry and its front groups. Plain packaging is a powerful policy measure fully endorsed by Heart and Stroke and hundreds of health experts in Canada. With regard to vaping products, Heart and Stroke's position on e-cigarettes has evolved over time with advances in research. And while the evidence regarding e-cigarettes continues to grow, there is still much left unknown. We continue to strive for a balance between the potential risks and benefits, and to that end, it is important that regulations ensure product safety and protect Canadians against potential harms. Experts agree that complete tobacco cessation over the long term, rather than reducing the number of cigarettes smoked per day, is the most effective way to reduce risk for disease and premature death. Heart and Stroke encourages people in Canada to strive for complete cessation as the best means of reducing tobacco-related illness. We recommend Canadians use cessation tools like nicotine replacement therapy, quit medications, and counselling. Some Canadians may find cessation benefit or reductions in tobacco consumption from the use of vaping products. But in Canada, as with elsewhere in the world, dual use of both e-cigarettes and tobacco is common, which puts into question the public health benefit of these devices. Heart and Stroke agrees that e-cigarettes are less harmful than combustible tobacco, and for this reason, we support increased access to e-cigarettes for adults. However, e-cigarettes are not without risk. Claims made by researchers which quantify the difference in associated harm between e-cigarettes and combustible tobacco are based on faulty methods and draw inappropriate conclusions. We have known for years that e-cigarettes are appealing to Canadian youth. A study found that 18% of non-tobacco using Canadian high school students had ever tried e-cigarettes, and another 31% were interested in trying them. Current use of e-cigarettes among 15 to 19-year-olds has more than doubled in the past few years. Studies also show that more teens are using e-cigarettes, seeing them as cool and fun. And research in Canada shows a link between e-cigarette use among youth and later tobacco use. We want to ensure that e-cigarettes do not result in nicotine addiction and tobacco use. It is essential that young Canadians be protected from marketing exposure aiming to increase the use of these products. Not only are there potential harms with the liquid constituents of vaping devices, but we need to protect non-smokers and youth from nicotine, which will become legal and more readily available once S5 is passed. Nicotine is a highly addictive drug that increases blood pressure, makes your heart work harder, and can cause blood clots. It is essential that S5 be amended to further restrict the marketing of e-cigarettes in Canada. In its current state, wide-scope marketing would be permitted and advertisements everywhere and anywhere. Television, online, video and ad for games, newspapers, magazines, billboards, public transit, social media, and the list goes on. Of great concern is the fact that marketing can happen in bars and nightclubs, places where young people often congregate and are under the influence of alcohol. This could make them more susceptible to marketing messages and creating opportunity for young Canadians to experiment with e-cigarettes. There is no need for marketing in places frequented by young people or the widespread marketing of vaping products to the general public. The only group that should be exposed to the marketing of these products are current tobacco smokers. The proposed ban on lifestyle advertising will not be strong enough to protect young people from the multi-billion-dollar marketing machinery of the industry. As such, we ask that Bill S5 be amended in relation to vaping products to include strengthened restrictions on e-cigarette advertising to align with the restrictions in the Tobacco Act and Cannabis Act, and the removal of the provision that allows lifestyle advertising in bars and adult publications. Heart and Stroke also formally endorses the recommendations proposed by the Canadian Cancer Society. To conclude, Heart and Stroke strongly supports the proposed legislation related to plain and standardized packaging and is recommending amendments to increase the impact of the bill. We urge that this committee make Bill S5 a key piece of legislation that truly protects our kids and prevents uptake by non-smokers in further restricting e-cigarette marketing. In adopting these amendments, S5 will become a strong and powerful piece of legislation to drive down tobacco control and put the health of Canadians first. Thank you for your time.
And thank you. Now we go to Dr. Ostiguy. 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I thank you for allowing me to speak to you today. I'm grateful for the invitation. Of course, I've been directing a smoking cessation clinic for quite a few years, and my experience is to deal with ill and very ill smokers. So this is more or less the sense of my intervention. And it is rather naive to think that all smokers want to stop smoking and are able to stop smoking. Nowadays, even the best clinical studies usually have success rate of less than 30% abstinence at 1 year. Approximately 1 in 3 smokers in the United Kingdom currently attempts to quit each year, but only about 1 in 6 of those who try to quit remains abstinent for more than a few weeks or months. So it is about 5.5% altogether. In Canada, 66% will attempt to quit in the next 6 months. Cigarettes, and I'm not the one who says that, I mean it's well recognized, cigarettes are the most addictive tobacco product. So if it is the most addictive tobacco product, it might not be that easy to stop smoking. It takes more than just willpower. We know very well that tobacco smoking has very dreadful consequences on health, both for the smoker and for the ones exposed to second-hand smoke. But smoking tobacco kills, but nicotine does not. Nicotine does not cause cancer, does not cause cardiovascular disease, does not cause pulmonary disease, COPD for example, but nicotine creates a dependence. And as a chest physician, I've seen enough lung cancer and cases of COPD and asthma and chronic bronchitis to know that this is dreadful consequences of smoking. I mean, lung cancer and COPD represents our daily bread in chest medicine. So 50% of smokers will die from a tobacco-related disease. Smokers will die 8 to 10 years earlier than non-smokers. Smokers who stop smoking before the age of 35 have a longevity similar to non-smokers. Smokers who quit by age 35 can live as long as non-smokers, both men and women. Very little attention is paid to this group of smokers. I don't have the time to talk about all the illnesses related to tobacco smoking. I'll concentrate on cancer. Smoking is involved in the etiology of at least 14 different cancers. For some of these, it is the main cause, like for lung cancer. E-cigarette vape might contain some carcinogenic substances, but it is less than 1% of the threshold limit value in the workplace, and up to 450 times lower than in cigarette smoke. Swedish people have used snus for many years since the beginning of the 20th century. They have the lowest lung cancer rate in the world. It is lower than the United States, lower than Norway. It represents an important fall in the number of deaths by cardiac attacks, a fall of 22% in men between 1987 and 1995. It has a low rate of buccal cancer, which keeps on falling in spite of increased use of snus. E-cigarette. Despite controversies, it is clear that e-cigarettes are far less hazardous than is tobacco, 95% less, and I hope that people had a chance to look at the fourth Public Health England report, which has been issued last week, confirming this conclusion. Smokers smoke primarily for the nicotine, but die primarily from the tar, combustion of tobacco. So, the smoking consequences on health. If you look at the number of illnesses related to tobacco smoking, and on the other side look at the addiction that might be created by nicotine, the question is, for nicotine-addicted tobacco smoker, is it ethically and morally correct to discourage them from using a 95% less harmful nicotine delivery system? Conclusions: e-cigarette can save many thousand lives. You have the numbers that have been figured out in Great Britain, in USA, in China, but it has to be regulated. It must not be advertised like my predecessor have talked about, but its availability must not be made more difficult than buying tobacco cigarette. And Dr. Pelosa just published recently a study that it is very important that the addicted smoker who wants to switch to the electronic cigarette be coached and shown how to use it. Because in my experience, older people, when they buy the electronic cigarette, they don't use it properly. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you all for your presentations. And now we'll go to our question period, and each member will start with 7 minutes, starting with Mr. Oliver.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your testimony and the research and leadership you've been showing on the issue of smoking and smoking cessation in Canada over the years. To me, and there's two populations that we're kind of dealing with here, or two issues that we're dealing with. One is stopping non-users, and particularly youth, from becoming addicted to nicotine. And I think the numbers are still quite alarming. I think I read just recently there's about 100,000 new daily smokers per year in Canada, and something like 82% of people start smoking at the age of 18 or younger. So there's clearly an issue of stopping young people and non-users from getting the habit. The second population or grouping are those that are addicted to nicotine, and trying to move them to a less harmful form, if given that the evidence isn't quite clear yet, but there's a fair bit of it, and or helping them quit. So my first question deals with that second population. So people who are addicted and want to move to a lesser form, or less dangerous form, or harmful form. So I had somebody in from the tobacco industry to meet with me to talk about their view in S5. They were sort of doing their rounds. And the concern they raised was section 20.1, where it says, no person shall promote a tobacco product, including by means of the packaging, in a manner that could cause a person to believe that the product or its emissions are less harmful than other tobacco products or their emissions. and the example was the heat not burn consumption. So I'd like to get your reaction to that first of all. Is that if the tobacco industry does believe they found a safer way to consume nicotine, they wouldn't be able to advertise or promote that in packaging. Do you agree with them, disagree with them? I'd like to hear your perspectives on that one, and I'll hear from each one of you if that's okay.
The international standard is for a complete ban on tobacco advertising. That's in the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. We support that. Canada does not have a ban. We have restrictions. But many countries do have a ban, including where e-cigarettes and tobacco products are sold. That product would be more harmful than e-cigarettes. And so, and e-cigarettes would be able to be marketed. And Health Canada, with an amendment at the Senate committee, it was already in the bill, but there's a clarifying amendment and a consultation document. Health Canada is intending to allow certain messages for e-cigarettes, with the health aspect. We support a total ban on tobacco advertising, far stronger than what's in this bill.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps add another comment in that I think you heard from several of us that we want the same level of restriction, or approximately the same level of restriction, for e-cigarettes and cigarettes. It's important to realize that tobacco can be advertised through information and brand preference advertising. You don't see much of it, I guess because the tobacco industry isn't proud of the true information about their product. But it might be different for e-cigarettes if they're allowed information advertising and brand preference advertising. Maybe we will see some that's legitimate.
Speaking more specifically to if there is a safer way to take in nicotine for those that are, if there's a safer way to take in nicotine for those that are addicted, should there be should the industry be able to advertise that? You're off in a bit of a different topic there.
Yes, we're supporting legalization of this bill precisely so that current smokers can legitimately get this product that may possibly offer them a less hazardous way of getting nicotine. The problem is that while supporting that view, you have to be concerned about the danger of introducing this product as well.
Thank you. I'm dealing specifically with 20.1.
What we're looking for is the balance.
Thank you. Okay. Lesley, do you have any comment on that?
So again, we support legalization of e-cigarettes with nicotine to offer Canadians the option. That said, there are better standards and devices available for cessation. If we want to target current people addicted to nicotine, as you mentioned, we have a vehicle in the tobacco package itself. So a message saying e-cigarettes are less harmful, right? And that's marketing to the exact audience we want to market to, and nobody else has to see it. So we have a solution right in front of us now.
But wouldn't 20.1 make that statement?
Sorry?
Wouldn't section 20.1 make that section, would make that not possible?
If it was a Health Canada message, it would be allowed, but it wouldn't be the industry able to make that claim.
Okay, thank you. All right, and then, so moving on then. So I think I've heard every single one of you say that S5 is not strong enough in terms of preventing youth and non-users from picking up the nicotine habit, becoming addicted. Every one of you said that there should be greater advertising restrictions for the e-cigarette vaping products, and have it match the. Do you have any reason why, or understanding of why Health Canada wouldn't have adopted that, given that we all agree that nicotine in and of itself is a harmful substance?
Well, I think it's a matter of getting the balance right. And I mean, this committee had a study with a report in 2015, with respect to this. And it's a new area, and they're trying to get the balance right. We think that where the line is drawn is in the wrong place. Okay. And so we'd like to move the line along with further restrictions.
And I'm certainly with you in that. I have to say categorically, anything we can do to stop new generations and non-users from becoming addicted to nicotine, we should be doing as a society. I mean, it's an incredibly addictive drug, and it's in all of our interest to see the addiction to nicotine ended in Canada, if we can get there. How am I doing for time?
30 seconds.
Okay. Sorry, and Doctor, I didn't, I missed you in the first go-around and the second. Do you have any thoughts about advertising, and is S5 restrictive enough for e-cigarettes and vaping, or do you think we should be doing more?
I think one of the problems that we're facing at the moment is that if you deal with a case of emphysema or a case of throat cancer, and they try 5, 6, 7 times to stop smoking with all the available tools that are existing at the moment, and they haven't been able to do so, and they say, well, then we could suggest to these, and this is the sort of clientele we had, we should suggest them, well, why don't you try the electronic cigarettes? Well, they say, well, doctor, why should I use the electronic cigarette? It is as harmful as the tobacco cigarette, and this is what is publicized actually, and this is the common thinking in the population. So it's very difficult. And as a matter of fact, in the last few years, people were coming to the clinic they already had bought their electronic cigarette. They haven't started using it because of this confusion that was existing in their mind. And they said, what do you think? Of course, I mean, this does not prevent us to suggest them the approved pharmacotherapy. I mean, you don't treat hypertension with one drug, you treat hypertension with different drugs, you treat diabetes with different drugs. Why can't we treat tobacco addiction with different means? And the message that is existing in the population at the moment, and I feel that this is very sad, is the fact that the population, and it's true also in Europe and in Great Britain, half of the population believe nowadays that electronic cigarette is as harmful than the tobacco cigarette. This is very unfortunate.
Okay, thanks very much. And now we go to Ms. Gladu.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for appearing today. My first question is for Mr. Cunningham, and it's on the subject of contraband. You know, we know that we have a significant problem today in Canada. 40% is one of the numbers I've heard across the country, although in Ontario I think it's even higher, 60%. So in terms of the plain packaging, I just want to confirm that the outside of the package still contains the protections designed by Health Canada. I think there was 17 different kind of technology preventions to keep them from being copied. And could you talk a little bit about those and about what to do to the actual cigarettes themselves in terms of this alphanumeric code that we spoke of?
So this is an example of a package from Australia. The brand name still appears, so you're able to tell which brand is which. On the inside, there is, on the cigarette, and companies are allowed to do this, a sort of letters and numbers that is unique to each brand. So that's one way that they are allowed, and they do in Australia, to make a distinction in the brand. Health Canada is contemplating that as well. In Canada, we do have on the package a tax marking. It's like money. It's a unique number for every different package. That will continue. But I think we can enhance that with a marking directly on the cigarette. And so we can tell what is intended for legitimate sale in Canada and not. It'll be a bilingual message, short. Every cigarette is doing you damage. Smoking kills, toll-free quit number. And you wouldn't have it on an exported product. And if somebody's in the United States or some other country, they want to divert something to Canada, well, it's a different step to have a marking. And so if it has a marking intended for Canada and they say it's for the United States, well, they're going to get caught. And if it doesn't have the Canadian marking, it's a tool, a further tool to help enforcement authorities. And there's good research to support it as well.
I have another question for you as well, because you seem to have quite a number of reports that show that implementing plain packaging will reduce the number of people that are smoking. Now, I know that you talked about the France situation. I did see that the Minister of Health had come out and said that the program was a failure, but you're indicating that's because they didn't take into account the fact that people had lowered their inventories in advance of the implementation. Japan also had Japan Tobacco International stating that the plain packaging had failed and called to end. So if you could just sort of summarize the 150 studies and what kind of reductions are they consistently seeing? Who had a problem, so that we can clear that part up?
So it's still clearly early years. Australia being the first, but some of the others, it's just been a year or so that it's been in place. So the full benefit is going to be over 20 years. Australia had a post-implementation review to conclude that it's being effective. All the evidence, except those funded by the tobacco industry, point in the same direction. And it's sort of intuitive. Billboards increase tobacco advertising. The package is a type of advertising. Increases consumption. So it's it increases the impact of health warnings. The reviews that have been done and supported by the World Health Organization, on and on.
My next question can go to anyone who's knowledgeable. I've heard that when it comes to vaping and the flavors that are used in vaping, there's a specific concern about an additive called diacetyl that causes popcorn lung. And I see, it's a very serious respiratory condition, but I see a lot of myths on the web, whether it's true or whether it's not true. Can you give us any information that you have about that condition?
Yeah, well, yes, there was a case report. First of all, I would like to say that, the electronic cigarette has been available in Europe for the last 10 years. And if there would be any harmful results or effects on the lungs, it would appear in our scientific literature. Now, if you look back at this report, of course, the popcorn lung did happen in the industry manufacturing popcorn. We haven't seen much popcorn lungs in the cinema, although they're exposed to the acetyl. And if you look at this report, it's a very, very bad report. I don't understand why the editor accepted to publish the thing, because they start by talking about hypersensitivity pneumonitis, like the farmer's lung, for example, and then they conclude that it is a bronchiolitis obliterans. It's illogical, and they didn't have a long biopsy to document the case. So we have to be extremely careful about these sort of reports, which are very alarming.
Right. So you think it's really not substantiated at this point?
No, not at all.
Okay. Great.
All right. And on the other hand, you have, with the use of electronic cigarette, we've seen that it's easier to control high blood pressure. You reduce the readmission or the exacerbation of COPD. Asthmatic patients are better controlled. So, it's been in use for the last 10 years. For these short-term ill effects of the electronic cigarette, it would appear in the literature. Now, for the carcinogenic effects of the electronic cigarette, of course, like I didn't mention it, the concentration are far lower than in the tobacco cigarette. And we still face the use of carcinogenic substance. We haven't stopped taking chest X-rays or X-rays we haven't stopped all the silicomine because it can cause silicosis. So it's a matter of dose-response relationship, and this is very often forgotten, that when you're talking about a risk, you have to consider dose-response relationship.
Okay, very good. My last question is for Ms. James. So if you we're talking about the harm reduction that we see with the e-cigarettes, and I know you mentioned that Health Canada can put that in their regulations, but do you think we should have that in S5 so that there is a sort of well thought out message that would be standard for everyone's use?
So you're asking if S5 should contain details around putting a message right on the tobacco product itself?
I'm asking for vaping products. What should we allow in terms of their ability to claim harm reduction?
The claims around harm reduction should be stipulated by Health Canada. So we should not be allowing industry to decide what claims are made. Health Canada is the one to evaluate the evidence, make the messaging that is appropriate for Canadians to interpret.
I think that's my time, Chair.
It is. Mr. Davies.
Thank you. I've got questions for all of you, but I want to have a quick yes-no from each of you. Mr. Oliver certainly articulated my view on this. He said that we want to do everything we can to prevent young people and non-smokers from starting to consume nicotine. Yes, no, Mr. Collishaw, does this legislation do that? Is it doing everything we can?
No, it does not, but it should.
Mr. Cunningham?
It doesn't in part, it can do more.
Ms. James?
It needs improvement.
Mr. Ostiguy? No. Okay, thanks. Now, Mr. Collishaw, I want to come back to you. You talked about key changes you'd like to see in legislation. You mentioned expanding the purpose of the bill, expanding the scope of the act. And you said you thought we should be imposing new requirements on tobacco industry. Can you please expand on what you would like to see in terms of new requirements on the tobacco industry that's not in the bill?
Yes, with this bill, we're going to legalize a new product and give the opportunity to tobacco companies to sell some other form of nicotine addiction to people. And they're going to claim it's less hazardous, and Dr. Ostiguy has presented some evidence that supports that view. If that's so, we think steps should be taken to oblige the tobacco industry to, at the same time as they're bringing in a new product, reduce the supply and demand for the very hazardous products, combustible cigarettes, that they're already selling. And this comes back to what I said about let's move from a slogan to a plan on less than 5 by 35. If we're going to have less than 5 by 35, well, let's have a plan with milestones to be reached, targets to be reached, corrections to be made if they're not, so that we do, in fact, achieve this noble goal that the government has set.
Thank you. Mr. Cunningham, quick question on vaping and on the plain packaging. On the vaping side, you said that the government said that vaping should be limited to brand preference only, but the legislation doesn't reflect this. Why would that be?
Well, perhaps it's just an oversight in drafting. I mean, they've made that statement publicly in what they've said related to the bill and regulations under the bill, and that's part of the review of committees. And so that's an opportunity for us to have an amendment.
Okay. Now, we've heard a lot of testimony on this, so I don't want to belabor it, but I mean, if S5 currently allows lifestyle advertising in bars targeting young non-smokers of the benefits of vaping, with things like allowing draws and contests to win beach vacations, access to invitation-only parties, tickets to concerts or sporting events. If that's allowed, that strikes me, I'm no marketing expert, but that strikes me as something that's probably going to cause a lot of non-smokers and young people to start nicotine. That sounds to me like more of a drafting oversight.
We think it's an important deficiency, and it can be remedied through an amendment. Okay. I mean, to ban all lifestyle advertising, period.
Do all of you agree with that? Yeah. And I'm coming back to you, Mr. Ostiguy, don't worry on this. On the plain packaging, I've been, it's my view, I'm going to be a little harsh on this. I view tobacco products to be an addictive carcinogen, has it's got no redeeming features whatsoever. We're the health committee, so I think we should be doing everything we can to stamp it out. I think the tobacco industry is kind of like a corporate zombie. It just keeps coming and coming and coming. If we don't close every single loophole, and that's the experience I think Australia has. I'm curious about on the plain packaging. Is there strong enough language? Well, I'll put it this way: the federal government. Where is it here? Here it is. In terms of the brand names and term on the package, the proposed regulations concerning plain packaging, Health Canada did not include the option of further regulating brand names beyond limiting the number of words they can contain. Is that strong enough, or are we going to see, smoking makes you taller, richer, better looking, and sexier Inc.?
I'm concerned about that, given what's already happened in Australia, where they have these extended names to try and have these lifestyle or positive, images created. And so I think when Health Canada does the regulations, they should ensure that they clamp down on that to avoid that type of messaging.
Okay. Ms. James, you showed us these, what I consider to be some of the worst marketing. This is marketing to young women.
Yep.
look like a cosmetic, and this is the type of cigarette they market that says Vogue on it. Does S5 ban these slim cigarettes?
The proposed regulations will, but an amendment to make sure that happens in S5 would be beneficial.
Okay, and would you have any advice to give us in terms of like the size of packaging? Should there be standard size and feel of packaging as opposed to these different?
That's a great question. So these packs are little. They fit in your clutch, in your purse, in your pocket. Youth like them. Young Canadians hate this pack. It's cumbersome, bulky. The warning is big. It's in your face. This is what the industry wants, a flip top, because it's still quite small and cute. If we can move ahead with anything, it's Slide and Shell. It's a big clunky pack that has large warnings and isn't easy to carry around.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Ostiguy, you said that e-cigarettes shouldn't be more restrictive to access than cigarettes. I'm going to flip that around. Do you agree that it should be as restrictive, though?
What do you mean? You mean the sale of it?
Yeah, well, in terms of the marketing, the promotion, the labeling, the packaging, would you agree that for all those things for e-cigarettes should be the same as restrictive as for tobacco products generally?
I do agree with Bill S5 that e-cigarette doesn't need to be advertised. I see the e-cigarette as a tool for the addicted smoker to stop smoking. But, for example, with the Quebec law at the moment, it's impossible for the owner of a vape shop to teach his customer how to use the electronic cigarette. This is not that easy to use it properly, and they're not even allowed to show in their vitrine the stuff that they want, they can sell. And I have this example of a vape shop where they have a blind in their windows, being unable to advertise the stuff that they could sell to an addicted tobacco smoker. But next door, there was a sex shop with all the stuff in the window, and the door is being opened. So let's be logical sometime in our legislation. The point at the moment that I'm concerned with is the fact that the population is under the impression that electronic cigarette is as harmful than the tobacco cigarette, but doesn't need to be advertised, but at least let the people, the owner of the vape shop, to be able to teach their customer how to use it properly and to be able to tell them that it is less harmful. I've seen lots of reference to the Australian experience, but I wish people pay some attention to the British experience. The document issued by the Royal College of Physicians of London, the fourth document published by Public Health England, and they're not that much. In the last report, Public Health England is even suggesting to have vape shop in the hospitals, and they're suggesting the National Health Scheme pay for the electronic cigarette to the addicted smoker. And we know very well that the greatest proportion of smoker is in less educated and less people who are poor than the better educated and richer person.
Okay, thank you very much. I have to cut you off there. Ms. Sidhu, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for all being here. This is an important study as we work the way to keep Canadians healthy. And my question is to Dr. Ostiguy. You have said that e-cigarettes are a good alternative to encourage people to get away from tobacco use. But many e-cigarettes comes with flavors like cotton candy, watermelon, black cherry. What is the purpose of these flavors? When they come with these flavors, are they not designed to get more people smoking, more young smoking?
Well, again, I would say that we have to. The British experience tells us that the electronic cigarette is prevalent or taken by people less than 1% of never smokers. So, and when we look at the statistics about the young people taking up vaping, we have to be very careful about the questionnaire. It's not because you've ever used the electronic cigarette once in the past month that you've adopted it. So it's better to look at the way that the British people have made up their questionnaire. They ask ever use, but they also routinely use. Do you use it on a weekly basis? And have you bought an electronic cigarette to use it? So the British experience says, and it's that less than 1% of youngsters, of young adults, take up electronic cigarettes who have never smoked. Most of them are the ones who've already started using tobacco cigarettes. And all these questionnaires, very often they don't ask, have you used an electronic cigarette with nicotine or without nicotine? They don't ask that questions. And they don't even ask also, if you ever smoked tobacco cigarette, have you tried the electronic cigarette in the past? So in the proportion of the youngsters who tried the electronic cigarettes, you already have the ones you've already used tobacco cigarettes. So we have to be extremely careful about the way these questionnaires are made.
Okay. Ms. Lindsay, can you speak to some of the concern that suggest e-cigarettes used by young people might lead to the tobacco use?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
It might lead to e-cigarettes used by young people lead to the tobacco use. Don't you think it can attract to youth?
There are, a lot of questions around whether e-cigarettes are a gateway to tobacco use. Mm-hmm. There are Canadian studies that say that longitudinally, when we look at a cohort of young Canadians, those who try e-cigarettes are more likely to initiate tobacco use a year later. There's still a lot that needs to be known, though, and what we are concerned about is when nicotine becomes legal in e-cigarettes, will these youth now have a nicotine addiction? And will this even further increase rates that we're already seeing are growing year by year? So in relation to flavors, we want to make sure there isn't a wide range of flavors like cotton candy and Hello Kitty cherry or whatever it might be. We want things that are appealing to adult smokers, but not youth. And we want to make sure that youth in general don't see marketing of e-cigarettes because it might lead to tobacco use later on.
Thank you. My next question is to Cancer Society. Many Canadians still smoke tobacco and many are becoming regular smokers each year. What can we do to reduce the number of the new smokers and help current smokers kick the addiction? What do you think about? Can you elaborate?
Well, we need a comprehensive strategy. Many things working in combination. Plain packaging is part of it. Banning flavored tobacco is part of it. But there's a great opportunity for Minister Petitpas-Taylor with the renewal of federal tobacco control strategy. The current one expires in March 2018. There's been consultations. The minister's been working on a new strategy, and that is a great opportunity to restore some initiatives that we previously had in terms of cessation, youth prevention, enforcement, mass media campaigns, all of the policy development, all the different elements that we can have that can really make a difference.
Okay. And Dr. Collishaw, what do you think about that? How we can reduce the number of Canadians impacted by the harm of tobacco smoking?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your remark. Could you speak up a little bit?
How we can reduce the number of Canadians impacted by the harm of tobacco smoking?
Oh, how many Canadians are harmed by tobacco? Well,
how we can reduce the number of Canadians impacted by the harm of tobacco smoking?
Well, we've made good progress in recent years, but most of the progress we've made against tobacco in recent years has been because there's been a lower rate of uptake among youth. And I would like to see that trend continue. And the challenge that we face with this bill is I'm afraid it may open the door for young people to pick up this product and become addicted to nicotine. So we'd like to prevent that before it happens and carry on with other measures in our comprehensive, strengthen our comprehensive tobacco control measures so that we can continue to lower tobacco use among our youth.
And just to add to that, a potential approach would be the polluter pays principle, where the tobacco industry is required to reimburse Health Canada for the cost of the tobacco strategy. Right now, Health Canada's $38 million budget works out to about $1.04 per capita. In the United States, it's about $3.60, more than 3 times the amount, if exchange rates vary. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration recovers the entire cost of its annual tobacco budget from the tobacco industry based on market share. That's something that we could do in Canada to have as much impact as possible to reduce youth use and to enhance cessation.
I should add that France has also adopted the polluter pay principle. They have a special tax on tobacco suppliers, and all of the money goes to fund tobacco control.
Thank you.
Okay, now that completes our 7-minute round. We'll go to 5-minute rounds, and we'll start with Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. And thank you all for being here today. A silly question to start with. I'm not a smoker. I don't hang out with people who smoke. So what is the difference between an e-cigarette and vaping? E-cigarettes and vaping, what's the difference there? Maybe Lesley can answer.
It's the same thing.
It's the same thing.
It's
Okay.
electronic cigarette, e-cigarette, vaping. Yeah,
All right,
it's
so
all the same
you just
terminology.
bounce back and forth from vaping to e-cigarettes, and
Yeah, it's confusing, sorry.
It's both the same. Okay, all right. Question to Dr. Ostiguy. Pardon my pronunciation there, Doctor. Let's say I am a smoker, and I come to you, to your smoking cessation clinic, and I say to you, Doctor, I really want to quit. I've had it with this. And you said in your presentation that it takes more than willpower. I've got the willpower, but obviously I need more. What would you suggest I do? Go with a nicotine patch or go with an e-cigarette? What do you tell your patients?
Well, the first thing, what have you tried in the past? And most people have tried many different things in the past. So we have to build on that sort of experience. Now you have to also assess how addicted are you a hardcore smoker or a light smoker? If you're a hardcore smoker, you have to assess this, and this could be assessed by the number of cigarettes you smoke. And of course, in a clinic like ours, we're measuring the nicotine level in their blood, which is a much better way of assessing the amount of dependence that these people have had. So then you discuss with the patient, what would you like to start with? And usually we were starting by the approved pharmacotherapy by Health Canada, nicotine replacement therapy. It's only recently that you've seen advertising that you should use combined nicotine replacement therapy. We've been using this for 15 years. I mean, because the patch does provide a level of nicotine which is very, very low, and you don't get the kick that the smoker gets with the. So you need a way of delivering nicotine which will go to your brain much faster than any of these devices. So you have to use combined therapy, and very often, for example, I had if I may, I had a patient with severe emphysema. He was unable to climb the 6 stairs coming up to the clinic. He was admitted 2 or 3 times a year for COPD exacerbation. He was using his action plan every month. We gave him Champix, we gave him patches, we gave him nicotine gums, we gave him bupropion, all of a failure. He decided to buy an electronic cigarette. After 1 year, his concentration of nicotine in the electronic cigarette was down to 3 milligrams per ml. He was not admitted for any COPD exacerbation, and he didn't use his action plan except once during that winter. And since he was in the construction business, He devoted a room in his house as a gym. So, I mean, I could tell you success stories like this times and time again.
Yeah.
But there's not one way of approaching. This is the sort of thing that you have to discuss with the patient. And unfortunately, unlike they do have in Europe, we should have more, in each hospital should have a good smoking cessation clinic that can address these hardcore addicted smokers.
Sure, sure. But you're suggesting that we need a product out there that can provide more nicotine in a patch, for example. It's not enough what's out there now?
I presume that you're aware of this study coming from the Mayo Clinic saying that, and the government pays for that people buying nicotine patches at the pharmacy without any counseling had a success rate of quitting smoking lower than the ones who quit by themselves cold turkey.
Yeah.
So you really need coaching and counseling.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. Real quick, Mr. Cunningham, your graph here that you gave us all here, the way it's decreased smoking in Australia. Can you just maybe clarify again what the reason was? What do you attribute to the success in Australia? What did they do there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of factors that would have contributed to declines. It's not just plain packaging. There's other measures in place as well. The Australian authorities, the health department, concludes that plain packaging was one of the factors that's contributed to the decline in prevalence.
Okay. Yeah, I see. Oh, time's up. Okay.
I'm going to go to Mr. Ayoub.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à vous.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm going to ask my question in French, so...
Donc,
So it's always very interesting and quite difficult, of course, to satisfy all people, offering you a solution that's going to cover all cases. The question that I ask myself, a bit like Mr. Weber across the way, I'm not a smoker and I don't have any experience at all about going to a vape shop or buying cigarettes or whatever. Do vape shops sell patches? Do they sell devices for smoking cessation? No. You were talking about guiding someone, assisting them in if they don't have a medical follow-up or some kind of framing to the issue. They have a very less likelihood of success in quitting smoking. Have we ever given thought to the issue of the nicotine that's perhaps in electronic cigarettes? Why are they not sold by health professionals, a pharmacy, for example, who can consult and assist the individual in proper use, as you indicated, and perhaps improve the possibilities of success, rather than over-the-counter, anywhere type of sales? Is that something that's been given any consideration? Well, what's your impression of that? Well, it has been suggested. In fact, I myself have talked to pharmacists on that issue, but the message didn't get through. Pharmacists could play a much more significant role in the anti-smoking campaign. They, in fact, do so with the pharmacopoeia therapies. What do you mean the message didn't get through? The disinterest? Yes, basically. They showed no interest in getting involved in that particular process. Mr. Collishaw? Well, I might add a word on that. These products have been on the market since 2009. And Health Canada has said these products will not be allowed unless it qualifies as a therapeutic device or product. And no one has ever put forward that kind of documentation or study, even if these products are deemed less dangerous than cigarettes, they don't meet the threshold requirements as a therapeutic good or product for Health Canada. So by making this a legal product under S5, we're creating a sort of third rail or third way, if you will, for what is currently a non-legal product. Oh, well, I might leave that from a technical point of view. Let's not talk about nicotine, but economically we talk about contraband, prices, taxes. If we take a look at legalization of marijuana and use that as an analogy, there are ways of calculating whether or not it will counter contraband product or not. And let's not forget that a smoker, a regular tobacco smoker, spends thousands of dollars a year to support his habit. By raising the prices up and up, it's a cost for some parts of the population, but for the user, the consumer of the good, it's quite likely that they might, look at the possibility of obtaining contraband product. Do you think that comes into play? Well, among teens in particular, they don't have that much money, so they might be tempted to go to contraband product. The contraband products are sold in Canada, obviously, and in the West and the Atlantic area, contraband consumption is much lower, while the taxes are higher. So it's not really high taxation. I think it's because of illegal processing plants, if you will, and the presence of large urban metropolitan areas where such products have become readily available. There are measures in place where we could try to slow down or stop contraband, but we have to do these in parallel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Dr. Ostiguy, what warnings or cautions do you believe should be labeled on nicotine vaping products? You indicate that you feel they must be regulated, but the availability must not be made more difficult than buying tobacco cigarettes. So what cautions or warnings would you advocate for on vaping packaging?
Well, I think that it should be it should be said that nicotine could become addictive, so this is something to be careful about. But this would be about the only concern that I would have about the electronic cigarette. And again, I wish people would pay more attention to the studies coming from England and from Europe, saying that for never smokers, it's very unusual for youngsters to take up the electronic cigarette. Of course, and it's even in the electronic cigarette, the addictiveness of the nicotine is not as strong as with the tobacco cigarette, because nicotine is addictive, but with the tobacco cigarette, I mean, you have all the other constituent of the tobacco that make it more addictive: the pH of the cigarettes, the flavor, the additive of some chemicals like menthol and these sort of things. So yes, nicotine could be addictive. Coffee is addictive also, but even in the electronic cigarette, the addictiveness is less than with the tobacco cigarette. And in my experience, what people, the heavy smokers, the addicted smoker, when they decide to go on and buy an electronic cigarette, very often people want them to stop from one day to the next day. It's not the way. They go down. They start with 18 milligrams, and then they go to 15, 12, 9, 6, and then to 0. So we have to be patient. It might take a year and a half to do so, but we have to be patient with a proper follow-up, though, a proper counseling.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to go on the record as saying I've never tried smoking a single cigarette. When I was 12, my father offered me $100 if I made it to the age of 18 without smoking a cigarette. It worked. I plan on doing the same with my family. Dr. Ostiguy, another question quickly. You mentioned that frequently, or not frequently, but it has worked that your patients move from cigarette smoking to e-cigarettes. Have you seen a trend, or could you perceive a trend in young people whereby they move from e-cigarettes to smoking? Do you see this as a possibility, or is there an increased risk or threat of this?
Not in our clientele. Of course, I was dealing with an adult clientele. But again, there's been an excellent review in the last document by Public Health England, issued last week, about the gateway effect that people were talking about. And it's very difficult to make a good, sound scientific interpretation of all these data because it's been done in different ways using different questionnaires. But the British experience is firm about saying that the electronic cigarette is not adopted by never smoker. It's less than 1%.
Ms. Cunningham, in your opinion, why do people start smoking? Do you think it is a coping method? Do you think it's to be cool? To me, this is just so much at the crux of this. Why, in your opinion, do people start smoking?
Was it to Rob or to me?
To yourself. Oh, sorry, Ms. James. So sorry,
okay.
My apologies. I was debating which of the two. Ms. James, please.
It's okay. People start smoking for a variety of reasons, and the marketing of tobacco products is definitely one of the reasons being so. Role modeling also plays a big part in this. So we see high levels of tobacco use among Indigenous populations in Canada, and it's quite hard for youth to not start smoking when they're surrounded by this in their environment. So any strategy that aims to reduce smoking and prevent uptake needs to address youth use, Indigenous use, and create opportunities where smoking cessation products are more affordable and accessible than the tobacco product itself.
So it sounds likely cultural. Mr. Cunningham, in 25 seconds, if you'd like to weigh in, please.
Well, there's many factors. Sometimes it's because it's available, sometimes it's low price, attractive flavors. For a certain segment of youth, it's a very positive product. That has a positive image that marketing creates, and that's why we need plain packaging.
And Dr. Ostiguy, in 10 seconds, why do your patients start smoking?
Well, I think, have you known of a teenager who doesn't want to try something that is a bit odd and a bit dangerous? Whether it's alcohol, it's driving, sex, anything. it's part of the teenager
I'll keep
mentality.
my $100. Thank you, Dr. Ostiguy.
Thanks very much. And now we go to Mr. McKinnon. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Ostiguy, you said, and I think everyone agrees, that vaping is safer than tobacco, that vaping is safer than cigarettes. And that seems plausible to me. I can think of a number of reasons why that might be so, but I'm wondering about the body of research behind that. You know, what do we have? Vaping's only been around, at least on the market, for about 10 years. Do we have really solid evidence that backs that up? So, Dr. Ostiguy, we'll start with you, if we could.
Well, for example, in Great Britain, 3 million people stopped smoking the electronic cigarette. And Farsalinas in Europe, with Euromonitor study, said that they estimate that 27 million people stopped smoking with the electronic cigarette. Like I said before, if there would be some ill effects of the electronic cigarette on the cardiovascular system, on the pulmonary system, it would have appeared in our scientific literature, and it doesn't. Now, for cancer, I think I don't need a placebo-controlled double-blind study to tell me that I'm less likely to kill somebody if I drive 20 kilometers per hour in downtown Ottawa than if I drive 120 kilometers per hour. So, knowing that the carcinogenic substance, which could be a concern, are in such a low concentration in the vape of the electronic cigarette that I think that this is a sort of risk. I'm not saying that it's harmless, completely harmless. The Royal College of Physicians in London doesn't say it's 100% proof safe. They say it's 95% less harmful than the tobacco cigarette. Most of the damage caused by the tobacco comes from combustion. And if you do have a product that doesn't have combustion, then you eliminate many of the ill effects of tobacco.
Go ahead, Dr. Collishaw.
Could add a comment. I don't think there's anyone here that doubts that vaping is going to be less hazardous than smoking, certainly for smokers. The problem comes with the potential public health effects. What happens if these products are widely available and people who never smoked started picking them up, or ex-smokers start picking them up? Then they're going to become addicted, and some of them are going to move on to combustible cigarettes, and the whole epidemic is perpetuated. So those are the problems we're trying to avoid, while maximizing the benefits that Dr. Ostiguy has referred to, where there's a potential for smokers who are unable to quit to at least have a somewhat less hazardous experience with satisfying their nicotine addiction. So once again, it's a question of balance. How can we get the benefits that are going to come from legalizing this product while guarding against the potential for harm? I would add further comment on what Dr. Ostiguy said earlier about how there hadn't been much problem in European countries where with young people picking these products up. But it should be noted that in most of these countries, advertising for these products is not allowed. And even in England, where some advertising isn't allowed and there's strong advocacy for the use of these products, the advertising that is allowed is much less than would be allowed under Bill S5, where there is a serious problem with people picking up, young people picking up these e-cigarettes in large numbers, is in the United States, where advertising for them is unrestricted. And that is a situation we do not want to get into in Canada.
Just to play devil's advocate a little bit here. So if vaping is 95% more safe than, say, smoking, there are very much fewer health consequences of it. The fact, I mean, nicotine is certainly an addictive thing, but so is caffeine, and I certainly have that problem myself. But it's not a life-altering thing. So, why do we care?
The 95% statistic is actually based on qualitative opinions. So we can't quantify and say e-cigarettes are 95% less harmful than combustible tobacco. So I really caution against using that number and us widely circulating that. We know e-cigarettes are less harmful, and Heart and Stroke believes that. We don't know how much less harmful, and we won't know for some time. It will take decades for us to figure out what this means in terms of long-term health consequences. What we do know is that nicotine is detrimental to youth development. So we need to keep it out of the hands of young people, and that's why marketing needs to be restricted.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we go to Mr. Davies for 3 minutes.
Thank you. I'm interested in exploring, Ms. James, the difference between vaping and heat not burn. I don't think we've had very much testimony on the heat not burn products, which, from everything I've heard, the tobacco companies are just they're at the gate waiting to come in and fully explore that. What are the health consequences or your thoughts on the heat not burn products?
Heat not burn products are very new, and they're being marketed as a reduced harm modality. There is no evidence to suggest that being the case. On the spectrum of harm, we see e-cigarettes on the one side, tobacco, combustible tobacco on the other, and heat not burn somewhere along that line, but we don't know where they are. We shouldn't be recommending Canadians be trying these products because it still is tobacco that is harmful.
Okay, I'm going to stick with you if I can. On nicotine, I'm a little bit confused about its long-term health effects. I don't want to put words in Mr. Ostiguy's mouth or not, but I almost had the impression that, I mean, you mentioned its effects on raising blood pressure and heart rate and other
Blood
things.
clots.
Blood clots risk. And again, not to be unfair to Mr. Ostiguy, but I heard him to sort of indicate that nicotine is not very harmful for our health. What do we know about the long-term health impacts of nicotine?
I'm not a clinician, so I'll let the physician speak to the long-term impact of nicotine, but we do know that the U.S. Surgeon General has reported that there is an increased heart rate, blood pressure, possibility of blood clots, and we know that over long-term, nicotine use among youth is detrimental to development of their brain.
Mr. Ostiguy, I'll give you a chance to tell me what, can I consume nicotine every day for the rest of my life with no health worries, or?
I don't think you should be. You shouldn't be very much concerned about this. Your body does adapt very rapidly to nicotine. Of course, after you smoke a cigarette, you might a very temporary acceleration of your heart rate, but it comes back to its usual rate. It doesn't have any long-term effects. So this is why I'm not promoting the advertisement of nicotine or any nicotine delivery device. I agree that, and the fact that the nicotine in any form shall not be available to people under the age of 18. I quite agree with that. But I don't think that we shall exaggerate the harmful effect of nicotine, except that you get addicted. And mind you, the smokers, they smoke. There's no better way to control your mood than to have a cigarette. What were they giving to the soldiers on the front during the war?
Well,
they were not giving them chocolate. They were giving them a cigarette.
Right, if I can stop there.
Time's up. Time's up. But now we have some time left, so what I'm going to propose, we have a round one again with 4-minute questions. That will allow us 5 minutes to get the question period, but each side will have an extra question based on our first round. So I'm going to hold it to 4 minutes, and we're going to start with Dr. Elson.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Dr. Ostiguy, I wanted to talk about, you were, of course, talking about some data in England, particularly regarding vaping and young people, and you said it's very unusual for young people to start vaping who've never smoked. According to the Canadian Medical Association Journal in 2015, it says that people aged 15 to 19 actually have, are twice as likely to have tried vaping than smoking. They found rates of 20% of people aged 15 to 19 have tried vaping, whereas 11% who of the same cohort have tried smoking. So would it be fair to say at least that the studies you're referring to out of England would not be applicable to the Canadian experience?
Yeah, I think you have to look at the question the way the questions were asked. Have you ever tried electronic cigarette in the last week? Have you ever tried electronic cigarette over the last month?
I said whether they have ever. Thank you. I'll finish that. But that was the question. Have you ever tried? They were twice as likely. That was the thing. Now another question coming up regarding the relative harm and whether this relative harm, and as you said, Ms. James, the qualitative as opposed to quantitative relative harm. Another Canadian Medical Association Journal article, and this is from October 2017. It talks about electronic cigarette use and smoking initiation among youth. And it says that, now, although I'll be the first to say it's correlation, we have not proven cause and effect, but this says very clearly on a very large longitudinal study that young people who start vaping are significantly more likely to take up the smoking of cigarettes. So is this not in itself, not a potentially harmful and dangerous product? I just ask yes or no from the board. Dr. Collishaw?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes, but with some limitations.
Okay, what are the limitations, very quickly, sir?
It has to be long-term study.
But we do know that the rates of addiction, that when one starts, one is very likely to be addicted. We do know that one starts as a young person. They are that's been known for decades. Would you not agree?
Well, you don't get addicted after smoking 10 or 15 cigarettes.
No, but but the more likely you are to smoke, the more likely you are to be addicted. I think that would be clear, has been clear for decades.
Well, I think again it has to be. I wish you go to the last report of the Public Health England issue last week, and they review all the studies, the American studies that you're talking about, the Canadian studies.
These are Canadian studies.
Yes,
they're fairly recent, large Canadian studies.
Yeah. They discuss all this, and it's very difficult to analyze all these data the way the questions were asked, and so you have to be very careful about saying that.
Well, we can only use the data we have.
Yes,
exactly.
But all the data all over the world.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. To Ms. Klander.
Thank you, Chair. Now, we all know that smoking is not good for you, so it's sad and troubling that the government is legalizing the smoking form of marijuana. I know there are some people that vape cannabis. So I don't really see that that's covered either in the cannabis legislation or in the vaping legislation specifically. Would you recommend that we include it, and if so, where?
Well, through a combination of Bill C-45 and this bill, it will not be possible to consume cannabis wherever smoking is banned in federal workplaces, or banks, or broadcasting, or RCMP, or federal government. Vaping devices can be used to consume cannabis and other substances. So that is a question if there's to be widespread advertising allowed of these devices, much more open than in the Cannabis Act. So the government should not intend to undermine the restrictions it has in the Cannabis Act.
I would agree, and with the legalization of marijuana, Heart and Stroke supports the low-risk user guidelines, and there are details in that developed by the Canadian Medical Association and the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health around how Canadians can reduce the risk if they choose to use cannabis. So within there are details about vaping marijuana.
Very good. Now, another myth-busting item. I hear quite often that folks who are either diabetics or in some cases obese and trying to get away from that are starting to vape using the very cherry flavory kind of things that we're talking about. Have you heard about this at all? Is this a myth? Is it real?
Well, I would expect it's anecdotal. I've seen no indication that this is widespread or any level of volume of activity apart from anecdotal.
Well, Tolosa in Italy has published a paper about this, and up to now, vaping doesn't seem to help people losing weight. But this is about the only study I'm aware of.
All right. One of the questions I have has to do with the nicotine concentration that we're going to allow. Do you think that we should be taking our signal from, the U.S. is trying to reduce the amount of nicotine that they're going to allow in products? Should we start with a reduced amount of concentration allowed in the nicotine for vaping products?
So with respect to vaping products, the government does have a consultation paper. They do have regulatory authority. There should be some upper limit in nicotine products as to how much nicotine would be allowed. A different issue is with respect to cigarettes, and a proposal to take nicotine out of cigarettes is simply not viable in Canada. People smoke for the nicotine. It'd be functionally the same as banning cigarettes, and in Canada we can't ban cigarettes.
One other question is about the age. So the bill that we have here is defining young persons as being under 18. And there are some provinces, I think, that don't allow tobacco products for those under 19. So what should we do in the bill? Should we go to the highest denominator and call it 19? Should we say whatever the age in the province is, or what would you recommend?
Keeping it out of the hands of young Canadians is vastly important, so if there's an opportunity to increase age to 19, that would be beneficial.
One option is that there could be regulatory authority to increase the age in the future.
May I add that, Mr. Davies? Oh, sorry.
May I add that in Europe, the maximum concentration of nicotine in the e-liquid is 20 milligrams per ml, and this has been adopted by most of the countries who've adopted the Tobacco Coalition. So I think that it's a reasonable target.
Okay, Mr. Davies, 4 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Collishaw, I wanted to get your opinion on the HEAT not burn product?
Regrettably, these are already on the market in Canada. We have no way of keeping recreational nicotine products off the market. In the United States, currently, they're under review and pre-market approval, and much ink has been spilled in the United States in this pre-market approval process. A scientific committee has recommended to the FDA that they not be allowed to make health claims. We'll see what happens. In Canada, what concerns me is even though all tobacco products are covered under the current Tobacco Act, there's not a proper set of regulations for heat not burn products, and there is an opportunity to at least partially correct this situation with some further amendments to Bill S5. I don't want to go into a lot of detail here. There's not a lot of time, but I can show all of you some proposals I have in that regard later on.
Mr. Cunningham or Ms. James or Mr. Ostiguy, whoever wants to answer this. You know, I remember my dad always telling me when he started smoking in the 50s, people kind of knew it was bad, it was frowned upon, but they didn't know that it caused cancer. You know, and then we've seen, in my lifetime, I've seen the development of tobacco products to light cigarettes, to slim cigarettes, to lower tar. It's just been a gradual movement of the industry to continue to adjust, to try to convince people that smoking is less harmful. So I'm wondering, here we're standing on the cusp of a new product. We've got vaping and we have heat not burn products. I'm not sure what else is ingested when you suck in the liquid nicotine. I'd be curious if there are any other chemicals, but do we have any concern that we're not going to be having a conversation 20 years from now like my dad did in the 50s to me when we say, geez, I wish we knew back in 2018 that there were more harmful effects from vaping or heat not burn products? Or are we sure at this point that that's not the case?
The experience over time has been that products turn out to be much more harmful than we think they were initially over the decades. And also, there were some predecessors to these heated products that were launched in the United States some years ago. The tobacco companies didn't disclose all their research. So they cherry-picked a little bit what research they disclosed. And of course, we have that concern today.
Ms. James, did you have a comment on that?
And I think for the reason that you mentioned, we need to be very cautious about who is using e-cigarettes. And like I've said before, the only group that should see marketing of e-cigarettes are current tobacco smokers. Other than that, there's no benefit to anyone trying e-cigarettes. We need to make sure they stay out of the hands of young people and they don't persuade non-smokers to start trying them.
Yeah, we have a lot of talk of this committee over the cannabis legislation, etc., over so-called entry gateway drugs, and great debate over whether it is or not. Is there any concern that people who start vaping could eventually migrate over to smoking cigarettes? Is that a concern? I mean, we're talking about it the other way. We're talking about moving smokers of cigarettes over to vaping as a bit of a harm reduction tool. But I'm just wondering, is there any research or concern about going the other way? If let's say this legislation goes forward and I'm in a bar, my children are in a bar, they're in their 20s and 30s, and they see these beautiful vaping advertising, they start vaping. Any concern that they might eventually be moved to cigarettes?
There definitely is concern because there'll be nicotine in these products once S5 is passed, and who's to know what will happen in terms of addiction from and choosing to use either an e-cigarette or a tobacco product. We do know from research that came out and was published in CMAJ that youth who use e-cigarettes a year later are more likely to be using tobacco products.
Time's up. Mr. Oliver. 4 minutes.
Great. Thank you once again. I think this is the last round of questioning you'll have to endure from us. So I've heard from all of you that you think there should be greater restrictions on advertising for vaping, and both the Cancer Society and Heart and Stroke, I think, well, it's just cancer maybe for both, have you've come up with some advice on that. So there were 4 sort of areas that you thought there should be vaping product amendments. One was to limit vapor product advertising to only be information advertising or brand preference advertising. Two is to remove the provision that allows lifestyle advertising in bars and in publications sent to an adult. Three is to restrict permitted vaping product incentive promotions to specialty vaping product retail stores, which is similar actually to cannabis. And the fourth one was to strengthen restrictions on the location of permitted incentive promotions to match the Tobacco Act restrictions. So those are four. Is there anything else that you thought from Cancer Society you would want to add to those? And to the other three, do you agree with those restrictions on vaping, advertising, and is there anything else you'd like to see us as a committee add to strengthen or reduce the amount of advertising possible for vaping products?
So I think I think you've summarized the key categories of amendments for the Act.
And Heart and Stroke fully endorses the Canadian Cancer Society's recommendations and rationale for them.
Okay. Is there anything Heart and Stroke would add to those restrictions?
No.
Okay.
In terms of correcting the problems we see with advertising, we also support this position. However, as I mentioned in my remarks, we have other concerns about how we should further restrict and diminish use of combustible cigarettes, but that's kind of another topic.
Doctor?
Well, I agree with the ban of advertising. It doesn't need to be advertised. The popularity of this gadget never came from the health professional of the medical society. It has come from the population. So they don't need to be. It doesn't need to be advertised. They'll go to it. The only thing is not to create barriers for the addicted smokers to be allowed to get the electronic cigarette if he wants to stop smoking.
Okay. And to be fair, just Mr. Collishaw, the recommendations from Cancer Society also had a number around smoking and smoking but I just wanted to focus because you're all very strong on vaping should not be allowed to. Vaping manufacturers shouldn't be allowed to advertise at levels beyond tobacco. That's the end of my questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, that's it. I want to thank you all for your presentations, and I want to go back to the introductions, and Ms. James had a line that really caught my attention. I checked it to see if it was accurate, and apparently it is. Tobacco use in Canada remains the leading risk of premature death in Canada, killing 45,000 people each year. I didn't think that number could be right, but it looks like it's the one that's most often used. Yeah. And then I went to compare the automobile fatalities, 1,858 per year. There's 20 times more people, based on that number, die from tobacco use than cars. And I think of all the things government has imposed on the automobile industry to reduce car fatalities, the headlights on, and backup cameras, seat belts, airbags, and so on and so forth. The government has required the companies to change their product to make it safer, and then they've tested it. They've made me do a lot of thinking anyway, so thanks very much for all your presentations, and I'm so glad you didn't get into all those books, Mr. Cunningham. I've been looking at those scared all during the meeting, but anyway, thanks very much. You've been great presenters, and you've helped us a lot. Thanks very much. And Akhil Johnson and Maxime Lay. And as an individual, do we have Sinclair Davison here?
Be appearing by teleconference.
Yes,
you do. Hello.
There we go. By teleconference. There we go. All right, so we'll open up with opening rounds, and each organization has 10 minutes to make an opening statement, and then we'll go to questions. So if Mr. Luongo or Mr. Klander, if you'd like to open up with a 10-minute opening statement.
Absolutely. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here to speak with you today. I'm Peter Luongo, the Managing Director of Rothmans and Benson and Hedges, Inc., a fully owned subsidiary of Philip Morris International. I'm here to talk with you today about our vision for the industry, how that vision aligns with our shared goal of reducing smoking rates in Canada, and the implications that Bill S5 has for that objective. First, our vision for the industry. Put simply, our goal is to stop selling cigarettes, and we can do this in a way that makes sense for us as a business and for society as a whole by switching existing adult smokers to alternative smoke-free products that significantly reduce their exposure to the chemicals in cigarette smoke that are linked to disease. Now, you may be thinking, if you want to stop selling cigarettes, why not simply stop? However, if we were to simply do that today, every single adult smoker in Canada who smokes our brands would most likely switch to another brand of one of our competitors. This would not serve the long-term goal of eliminating smoking. But we believe that by introducing new reduced-risk products and by educating adult smokers of the benefits of switching, we can reach a point where we can envision a phase-out of cigarettes. Now, we know that this is a massive undertaking and will require time and support from the government and other stakeholders, but it is a goal we should all share. Now, you may also be thinking, why now? What has changed? Well, put simply, technology. For more than a decade, PMI has been developing a series of smoke-free alternatives, products which are designed to replace cigarettes for adult smokers who are not seeking to quit tobacco altogether. As an industry, we finally have products which both satisfy adult smokers and also significantly reduce their exposure to chemicals. And this is based on the simple fact that nicotine, while addictive and not risk-free, is not the primary cause of smoking-related diseases. But it is ultimately a large part of what smokers are seeking from cigarettes. As the old quote goes that was mentioned earlier today, people smoke for the nicotine, but they die from the tar. It is the burning process, the combustion that occurs when tobacco is lit on fire that creates this tar, not the mere presence of nicotine. So all of the alternative products we are looking to introduce have several things in common. They all produce an aerosol vapor, and they all contain nicotine to address smoker preferences, but they also all eliminate combustion. By eliminating combustion, we dramatically reduce users' exposure to these harmful chemicals if they fully switch to these products. And we know from the millions of smokers in other countries that have already switched that we are talking about reality, not theory. So maybe a little bit of background on what we are doing today in Canada with one of our alternative smoke-free products called IQOS. IQOS is an electronic device that heats specially manufactured tobacco sticks to release an aerosol vapor. The vapor contains nicotine and is similar to the vapor produced by an electronic cigarette. When compared to a reference cigarette smoke, the aerosol vapor produced by IQOS contains, on average, 90% fewer harmful and potentially harmful constituents linked to smoking-related diseases. Looking specifically at the 14 carcinogens identified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the reduction is greater than 95% on average. And recently, an advisory committee to the Food and Drug Administration in the United States concluded that switching completely to IQOS can reduce smokers' exposure to harmful smoke compounds by a vote of 8-1. To be clear, we are not saying smoke-free alternatives are risk-free. They are not for non-smokers, they are not for youth, and they are not for people who smoke today who want to quit tobacco and nicotine altogether. Smoke-free alternatives such as IQOS are for adult smokers who will otherwise continue to smoke without a satisfactory alternative. But with over 4 million adult smokers in Canada today, it is imperative that we provide such alternatives. Now, if IQOS is legally available today in Canada, you may be wondering what the problem with Bill S5 is. Well, to start, I think we can agree that for someone to switch to a product, they need to know that it exists and how it compares to cigarettes. But if Bill S5 is passed in its current form, it will be illegal for me to share everything I have told you so far about how IQOS compares to cigarettes with Canadian adult smokers. Specifically, Section 27 of Bill S5 prohibits anyone from making comparisons between any two tobacco products or their emissions. Because the IQOS unit heats tobacco, it will be considered a tobacco product. As a result, we would not be able to clearly explain the differences between IQOS and any other tobacco product, including cigarettes, regardless of what the scientific evidence shows to be true. But it is important for the committee to remember this is not just about the product that we as RBH have on the market today. Our competitors in the industry have products which also contain tobacco and which operate under similar principles of avoiding combustion while still delivering nicotine. And it is not only about products which have already been invented. It is recognizing that through additional research and development, these categories will continue to evolve to provide smokers with ever more and better alternatives in the future. As drafted, if there is a tobacco product which is proven to be lower risk, there will be no way to explain that fact to consumers without further amending the legislation, which could be a very lengthy process. And during this time, you would have millions of adult smokers in Canada making choices about their health without having all of the relevant information and access to the best available science. Therefore, our recommendation is that Section 27 be amended to create regulatory power and put tools in place to take advantage of the opportunity that we believe these products represent, and to have regulations reflect the latest available evidence that exists. The Senate modified a similar section of this bill dealing with vaping products so that through regulations, authorized statements could be created by Health Canada which strike a balance between providing adult smokers with the information they require to make informed choices, while at the same time preventing them from being given a misleading impression. A similar change to the tobacco section of Bill S-5, giving Health Canada the power to create tailored regulations going forward, is a reasonable and balanced step for this committee to take. Now, you don't have to believe everything I've said today. You don't even have to believe that IQOS is a better choice than smoking. You only have to believe that it is possible for a tobacco product to exist which has lower risks than cigarettes. And if it is possible, I think we should all be able to agree that adult smokers in Canada have a right to that information and that the law should provide flexibility for regulations to reflect that fact. And before I conclude, it's also important to recognize that given the ongoing evolution of these categories, we will continue to need to study and update our knowledge on these new alternatives. So our second recommendation is for this committee, in your report on Bill S-5, to recommend that the Government of Canada and the upcoming federal tobacco control strategy commit to funding research into smoke-free alternatives, including heated tobacco products and electronic cigarettes, to help inform future policy discussions with evidence that is entirely impartial. Doing so will provide legislators and regulators with substantiated third-party information regarding the science behind smoke-free alternatives and better enable a more fulsome dialogue about the potential of harm reduction in tobacco to achieve the goal of 5 by 35, a goal we all share. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we'll go to the Canadian Convenience Store Association. Mr. Chera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Satinder Chera, and I am the president of the Canadian Convenience Stores Association. Our association is proud to represent 27,000 small business owners across Canada who serve 10 million customers each and every day. As you will note from the materials in your kits, our channel provides employment opportunities to over 234,000 Canadians and collects over $22 billion in taxes for all levels of government. And our stores ensure that Canadians have access to necessities and basic groceries wherever they live, including a third that serve rural and remote regions of the country. In our vast country, it is the distributors who provide this critical link, getting those necessities to our stores, which is why I'm joined today by Kothawala, who represents that part of our industry. For our industry is much more than our contribution to the economy. We support local sports teams and charities. Last year, we held the first ever National C-Store Day, where politicians and community leaders worked a shift in our stores and helped us to raise over $80,000 for charity. Our channel is constantly changing and adapting. You can buy food service items like samosas and healthier snack options such as energy bars. 20 years ago, newspapers were a significant part of our sales. Today, they are not. Tobacco sales have also declined, just as the number of Canadians who smoke has declined, and this is a good thing. However, those sales have moved to the illegal market. Across Ontario, 1 in every 3 cigarettes sold is illegal, and as a high of 60% in some markets throughout the province. Please find more information regarding contraband in your kits. Just so we are very, very clear, we're not here to defend tobacco industry. After all, tobacco is a cause of serious diseases. That said, so long as Canadians choose to smoke this legal product, our retailers continue to represent the most responsible avenue for them to buy tobacco products. We are the most responsible safeguard to keep tobacco products out of the hands of children. It is in this context that we work with the tobacco companies, along with confectionery, snack, and beverage manufacturers, who are all non-voting members of our association. My colleague and I are both parents. And like any parent, we don't want our kids or any kids to get their hands on tobacco products. In fact, retailers play an important role in keeping these products out of the hands of youth to begin with. Through display bans and identification checks through our We Expect ID program that is included in your kits. Convenience retailers are part of the solution to preventing kids from smoking, not in opposition to it. We are here today to raise concerns from our members about the impact the proposed plain packaging legislation will have on our stores. We fear that despite the intent of the legislation, efforts to reduce tobacco consumption will be wasted and ultimately worsened by this bill. We will also talk about the vaping side of S5, where we fully support the government finally stepping in to regulate this promising development for consumer choice. Our channel has proven to be the best at age testing when measured against a beer store or government-owned LCBO in Ontario. According to data from Smoke Free Ontario, public health units have conducted over 20,000 underage mystery shops with a pass rate of 96% by convenience stores in Ontario. Committee members may be asking, if 75% of the package is already covered by warning labels, what does it matter if the remaining 25 is too? For three reasons. Like any product, branded packaging gives consumers the assurances of quality and reliability and helps them to distinguish one product from another. Standardizing cigarette packaging will make it much more difficult to differentiate legal from non-legal products. More so, S5 allows for the standardization of the cigarette itself. Forcing legal products to look like their already standardized illegal counterparts will only further encourage consumers to make their purchasing decisions on price alone. And the cheapest products will always come from the black market, free from any tax or ID check. 2, we already compete with an illicit market that is double the global average. With plain packaging, we expect to see counterfeiting becoming a bigger problem than it already is. 3, because of the black market, law-abiding convenience stores lose not only tobacco sales, but also the purchases that go along with them: milk, bread, lottery tickets. Governments lose tax revenue, and no one is there to prevent children from buying illegal tobacco. We know committee members have heard a lot about the black market and contraband lately, having just studied Bill C-45. Many witnesses have remarked on the importance of addressing the black market when it comes to cannabis, and several have pointed to branding to visually separate these products and provide consumers with basic information about the product and a quality guarantee. Our members cannot understand why then the government is trying to curb black market cannabis. They choose to proceed with plain packaging for tobacco, which will be a boon to the already thriving black market. If the shared problem between tobacco and cannabis is the black market, why are we treating these products so differently? This is compounded by stories from retailers in other countries where they have adopted plain packaging. Our Australian retail counterparts have struggled with inventory control, staff training, and customer transactions without any of the intended benefits. Contraband rates increased by 20% in that country after plain packaging was introduced. More recently, the Australian and French governments have both stated that plain packaging did not have the desired impact on smoking rates. As you can imagine, our retailers and distributors hear these stories and are naturally questioning whether we should expect to see any different outcome for plain packaging if implemented here in Canada. I'll now turn it over to my colleague to conclude our remarks.
Thanks, Satinder. Without adequate resources to deal with contraband tobacco and without adequate time to prepare for the consequences of plain packaging, already stretched small businesses will take a hit once again. A poll of our retailers, which has been shared with Health Canada, found that over 88% of staff use brand logos to differentiate between tobacco products. 97% of retailers believe that they would need to increase staff training to ensure proper inventory control, stock management, and customer service if plain packaging restrictions are imposed in Canada. Our stores and our distributors are not asking for any compensation to assist with this transition. But what we are asking for is time to deal with what we know the fallout will be. While it's not in the mandate of this committee to recommend, we believe the government should address the issue of contraband tobacco before moving ahead with S5. The Senate Social Affairs Committee noted this in its report, that more should be done to fight the black market. Health Canada is contemplating studying the illegal market in its renewed tobacco control strategy, and we support that effort. We need action. Illegal tobacco is unregulated, untested, and untaxed. Many have 0% health warnings. The existence of this significant market undercuts every single one of the government's tobacco control measures and goes against the government's stated rationale for plain packaging. Providing law enforcement with greater resources specifically allocated to eliminating contraband tobacco is one option. Funding a regular study to evaluate the state of contraband tobacco and regulatory impacts on illegal tobacco usage rates is another. It is worth noting that this is not something that the Government of Canada currently tracks. To support this committee in its ability to recommend amendments to the proposed legislation, we offer the following recommendations. First, to help mitigate the impacts of plain packaging on our small businesses, allow for some type of visual differentiation on packages, perhaps on the cellophane overwrap, which has the added benefit of being removed as soon as the package is opened. This would help to distinguish legal from illegal products, particularly for law enforcement. The RCMP have raised concerns about contraband tobacco, particularly the links to organized crime. In a recent massive seizure of drugs, weapons, and contraband, their press release stated, and I quote, "This investigation demonstrates the strong ties between contraband tobacco and the organized crime community." From a distributor perspective, this is crucial when it comes to shipments of cartons of cigarettes. Very rarely are cartons purchased in stores, as you can well appreciate because of the cost, but our distributors use the visual differentiation to pick and fill customer orders. We understand that the UK plain packaging legislation focused specifically on products destined for retail rather than on shipments. We believe Bill S5 should include that same provision. The committee may also want to consider extending this same logic to individual cigarettes. Some differentiation would likely assist law enforcement when telling legal from illegal products apart. Our second recommendation would recognize that many of our retailers and distributors are small businesses already burdened by excessive red tape and regulation. By not allowing for a reasonable transition period for our stores and their distributors, this will hurt our already struggling channel. Should this legislation proceed, we implore you to consider amending S5 to include a separate adjustment and sell-through period for retailers and distributors of between 12 and 18 months. Our third and final recommendation deals with vaping. We support the government 100% in finally regulating this product. We find it extraordinarily unfair that our stores and distributors have followed Health Canada's directive to refrain from selling vape products with nicotine, while illegal vape shops have been allowed to pop up on street corners in virtually every community. With growing acknowledgement of the benefits of vape products as an alternative to traditional cigarettes, we ask this committee to create a level playing field by allowing for limited, substantiated communication by convenience retailers about alternative nicotine-containing products, including electronic cigarettes and heated tobacco products. We thank you very much for the opportunity to present today, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we go to Freeze the Industry. Ms. Bergeron or Mr. Johnson?
Imagine if an airplane manufacturer sold airplanes that routinely fell out of the sky and killed 45,000 people per year. Surely that would not be normal. People would outcry and demand that steps be taken to protect the public. That would be normal. Good evening, good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. We are here together to talk about Bill S5, the issue of plain and standardized packaging, and introduce our group called Freeze the Industry. That quote I recall from my first Unfiltered Facts meeting. Unfiltered Facts is a youth advocacy anti-industry group in Hamilton, Ontario. And I thought about it long and hard. This was a self-evident truth. I thought to myself that this was crazy. Why? Because tobacco is the only product that, when used as intended, kills over half of its users. And it seemed to me that nobody cared that smoking kills or that tobacco usage kills. We hear it all the time and we just brush it off. I couldn't just sit by while this was happening. I'm also a Seventh-day Adventist. Our church believes that good health is vital to good living. We must do all that we can to ensure that we live the best and healthiest lives. Thus, in that singular moment, I became passionate and energized. I was ready to advocate in my school, in my church, in my communities, in Ontario, across Canada, North America, and in the world, that the industry targets youth to be replacement customers. No longer could smoking kills work. I had to get the message out there to resist big tobacco, revolt against its manipulative tactics, and unite in solidarity that we would never use their products, and advocate to other youth about this shady industry. That's how I became an advocate, and it's been nothing short of a powerful journey. I've been able to witness firsthand how youth advocacy has helped shape and change society. Whether it was in Hamilton, where we informed and gained 5,000 petitions in support of smoke-free movies, or helped lower the smoking rate in high school to 6%. But that's not all. Throughout my volunteering and time spent at Unfiltered Facts, I learned about a provincial-wide network of youth and young adults who were committed voluntarily to fighting the industry in Ontario. Thus, I got involved with this network known as Freeze the Industry. It was through Freeze the Industry that I saw youth become informed and empowered. I saw youth take an interest in the Canadian political and democratic process. I've had the joy of being a youth advocate and seeing youth advocacy result in laws passed and new policies implemented. Some of these include power walls, the banning of flavoring in tobacco, the regulation of electronic cigarettes, the banning of smoking in parks and on patios in Ontario, the divestment in big tobacco by the University of Toronto, regulations on hookah and shisha, and recently McMaster universities having gone tobacco-free, and that is University in Hamilton. I've seen so much accomplished, but I know there's a lot more to get done. Whether it's tighter regulations on flavors in tobacco, a moratorium on new products, or the implementation of plain and standardized packaging, which is why we are here today. The fact remains, the cigarette packaging is a mini billboard. It's flashy, it's bright, it's colorful, and attractive. We want people to understand that items that look friendly should not be deadly to your health. Otherwise, friendly should not be deadly. One would not advertise rat poison or bleach the same way you advertise sugar or apple juice. And so, in addition to countless of other youth from across Ontario and across this nation, we support the passage of this legislation and will continue to advocate in favor of it and strive to inform the public of the importance and necessity of this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. I come here wearing many hats. I am a science student, a volunteer, a sister, a daughter, and a community leader. As a master's student conducting research on innovative cancer therapies here in the nation capital, I have come to appreciate the repercussions of tobacco products on our economy, our healthcare, and families. As you perhaps already know, treatment of tobacco-related conditions cost Canadians an estimated $6.5 billion in direct healthcare costs and kill 100 Canadians every day. Smoking remains the foremost cause of premature death, and we must act. I can testify firsthand that research innovates at a rapid rate, and progress in the field of medicine has significantly improved the prognosis of various diseases and continue to improve the quality of life of many patients. However, we must also acknowledge the power of education and prevention. Plain and standardized packaging elevates the impact of the health warnings and prevents the use of deceiving designs. As a volunteer in my community, I know youth have opinions towards public health issues, and they deserve to have their voices heard. As an ambassador with Freeze the Industry, I have witnessed the support of younger generations towards plain and standardized packaging. Last November, approximately 100 youth and young adults expressed their support for plain and standardized packaging at our Freeze the Industry Make 'em Plain rally on the Hill. We understand the dangers of smoking and recognize that the tobacco industry employs various strategies to deceive. We know that plain and standardized packaging will spread this knowledge by highlighting the health warnings and will prevent new smokers from falling in the tobacco industry's manipulative traps. Finalement, c'est important tous ces chapeaux aujourd'hui.
It's important to note today to indicate that I would do support the amendments of S5 as to standardized and plain packaging. Together, I'm sure that we can assure a better health outcome for Canadians currently and in the future.
Smokers pit outside every morning, lunch, and after class. Nowadays, when I'm not busy studying or conducting research on population health, serving as a patient advisor to the Ottawa Hospital, or advocating for tobacco endgame measures with Freeze the Industry, I bring my little brother to this very same school, and without fail, the smoker's pit endures. Masked behind plumes of cigarette smoke, I can see some new faces from back when I was just a youth. But nonetheless, the fact remains that it is the young, the vulnerable, and those that just want to fit in that populate this pocket of poison. So I asked my little brother if he knew who they were. And his answer was that it's all the cool kids that go there. Quand j'étais plus jeune, ma mère fumait. Heureusement,
while I was younger, my mother smoked. Fortunately, she quit. But occasionally I did inhale secondhand smoke. Her lifestyle made her addicted to this, but it wasn't her fault. Her entire circle smoked. It was normal in those days. It's what people did. My studies has made me learn that Francophones, compared to others in Canada, are more addicted than others, and for various reasons, 35% of Francophones are smokers in Canada.
Tobacco in many ways, not just by smoking it and poisoning their body, but also by robbing the lives of the loved ones they care about. This summer I was in an accident and required surgery. When I was transferred to my overnight bed, a fellow patient became my roommate. They required surgery as well, and when they were getting prepped for anesthesia, one of the staff members asked whether or not they smoked. The answer was yes, and because of this, they were made aware that smoking could complicate the procedure. The little girl that was with them started to cry and became worried. Can you imagine how she would have felt if her parent died because of that? For me, advocating for and supporting Bill S5 with Freeze the Industry means saving my little brother from the influence of tobacco packaging. L'implémentation de la loi S5 permettrait à ma génération.
The implementation of S5 will allow my generation to become healthier and have children that are healthier, all by reducing the health status of minority communities.
But also, young people in particular who are tired of having seconds, minutes, or years of their lives taken away from tobacco-related death. Freeze the Industry allows me to be this advocate and to be the role model I want my brother to have. We urge this committee to take our perspectives seriously and to follow through with our recommendations to implement plain and standardized packaging so that every Canadian, from sea to sea to sea, are happier, more productive, and can lead healthier lives. We thank you for your time today and this opportunity that we have, and we look forward to our discussions later on.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we have an invisible witness, Dr. Sinclair Davison from Melbourne, Australia. Are you with us, Dr. Davison?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Okay, we've never had an invisible witness before. We're sorry about this, but we have a technology issue, I guess. So, but welcome, and we look forward to your opening statement.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So I'm a professor of economics at an Australian public university. I'm also associated with some free market think tanks, the Institute of Public Affairs and the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. As part of my overall research program over my career, I have looked at various government policies, ranging from things such as insider trading, native title, petrol pricing, all sorts of things along those lines. And one of the public policies that I have looked at is the plain packaging policy that was introduced in Australia in December 2012. Now, I think we can all agree that smoking kills and that rates of smoking in our society is probably a lot higher than what is socially desirable. The real question is what best to do about the fact that people choose to smoke. Now, what I'm going to argue today is that if the Canadian government wishes to do things about smoking rates, they need to do the hard policy work around issues such as excise pricing, public education and information, and also the provision of substitutes to smoking. Particularly, my argument is that people should focus on actual results, not virtue signaling, and should stay away from utopian public policy making, where the idea under utopian public policy making is that there are free lunches, that people would be different, that things could change for the better if only we all tried and worked harder. Now, it turns out that the Australian policy of plain packaging failed. Now, you don't have to believe me to come to this particular point. If we have a look at the latest Australian National Drug Strategy Survey results, the decline in smoking prevalence in Australia stalled after the introduction of the plain packaging policy. The government's wastewater intelligence survey found that the amount of nicotine in Australian wastewater has actually increased over time. The size of the contraband market has increased dramatically over time. And the bottom line is that a policy experiment was attempted. The notion that somehow by taking away the branding of packets that you could emphasize the graphic health warnings was an experiment that was probably well worth trying. The Australian government did this experiment. They conducted a tracking survey to see how it would work. And the fact of the matter is the experiment has failed. It turns out that taking away branding adds costs to the economy, which previous speakers have spoken about, but does not actually reduce the prevalence and incidence of smoking. In fact, today in Australia, there are more people smoking than what there were 5 years ago when they introduced policy. Now, what some of my colleagues and I have done is we've had a look at the government's own survey results, taking their own data, using their own techniques. And what we find is that the graphic health warnings are, as a form of public education, do have an effect on reducing smoking rates. What we found, however, is that the size of that effect actually declined after the introduction of plain packaging. So graphic health warnings in Australia were introduced in 2006. And you can see very clearly they do have an impact on people's smoking behavior, but taking away the branding, the notion that somehow people would be more aware of the brand, of the graphic health warnings when we took away the branding, did not work. There is no evidence, even in the government's own data, to suggest that that is the case. The other thing is when you have a look at the packs themselves, the government's own research found that the appeal variables of the packets themselves did not really have a big impact on intention to quit and quitting behavior. So, yes, it was probably a good idea. It should have been tried. I can't say that it has succeeded, but more importantly, I suspect, given that it's going to be very difficult for the government to not go ahead and do something along these lines, if I could make some recommendations that if the Canadian government does go ahead with the S5 bill, that it actually introduces a sunset clause so that after a period of, say, 5 or 10 years, the legislation could be reviewed and renewed necessarily if it has been successful, but that a formal tracking study be commissioned to measure the success or failure of the policy, that the tracking study include full assessment of all health, economic and social costs associated with the policy, especially looking at the impact on small business, on convenience stores, on insurance costs, because we know crime will increase. That the tracking study be conducted in an open and transparent manner by people who are not intimately associated with the policy themselves, and that formal and transparent cost-benefit analysis be conducted by credible external individuals, and that all of this data be made available on the Health Canada website for external verification and analysis. I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for your presentation. Sorry about the problem with our technology, but you've certainly made your message very clear, and we appreciate it a lot. We're now going to go to our question period, and we'll have 7-minute questions. We're starting with Dr. Ayolson.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for coming. Mr. Luongo, you were talking about IQOS, and you're describing IQOS as a less harmful alternative to actual combustion of cigarettes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And what is that? What research is that based on, that this is less harmful?
Well, it's based on a wide body of research that's looking at a number of things.
Okay. Right? What research is that? Is this industry sponsored? Is it independent, peer-reviewed scientific research? Who's doing this research?
Absolutely. Well, it's a combination of industry-sponsored research. We obviously pay for a large portion of the research that is done for here, but it is also being independently verified by numerous people around the world.
Okay, who are these numerous people? Universities, research institutes. Can you supply some references as to non-private industry-sponsored research, peer-reviewed scientific research supporting this?
Absolutely. I think the most recent would have been Public Health England, which said that all of the evidence suggests that there is a reduction in harm associated with these products.
Public Health
England.
England. Okay. All right. Because and when was this? When was this published?
That report came out just a few weeks ago.
All right. I mean, the reason I ask is that there's I was reading a statement from the Conference of the Parties of the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and they're basically what they have been saying, and I've been hearing from other experts in other meetings as well, saying that the only evidence that they've found that actually says that there's less harm is industry-sponsored research, and that there's been no definitive evidence to support this claim that these are less harmful.
Well, number one, there have been a number of people who have come out, including Public Health England. There was a recent review done of all of the evidence submitted to the FDA in the U.S., where there were a number of positive statements that came out of that, including, as I mentioned in my testimony, the committee, recognizing by an 8-to-1 margin that completely switching to IQOS would reduce people's exposure.
Oh, I'm sorry. And who was on this committee?
It was a group of people picked by the FDA for their independence explicitly. I can provide a list of those names, but
okay, thank you. Yeah, if you could perhaps, particularly that study from Public Health England, we'd if that could be submitted to the committee later,
absolutely,
we'd appreciate that. Thank you very much. I have limited time, so I'd like to go on to this. Mr. Chera, you talked about the issue with contraband tobacco and how plain packaging would increase contraband. You said that the government of Australia said that this is increasing the rates. Correct me if I'm wrong. Did you say? I wrote something down here that you said the government of Australia said that this is not working. That in fact it's plain packaging is increasing the rates of contraband tobacco.
What I was referring to is a report that was done by the Australian government where they found that over the last 3 years, under plain packaging, the decline in incidence of smoking had actually stalled the decline, that it hadn't continued the way it had prior to plain packaging being introduced. And it was an observation. And what we noted was that one of the reasons that plain packaging was brought in, from what we've heard from our counterparts down in Australia, was that it was plain packaging. The purpose was to help to reduce the incidence of smoking. And the government's own analysis had shown that it actually had stalled.
Okay, yeah. And again, I beg to differ. We've been reading reports from the Australian government, also from the World Health Organization, and we had a previous witness from the Canadian Cancer Society who was basically able to although we hadn't read them all yet, he was able to refer to 150 peer-reviewed scientific studies that showed, in fact, that plain packaging does, in fact, not reduce or does not increase the rate of contraband tobacco, and in fact also does help to decrease smoking rates. So,
if I could,
yes.
There are 3 countries in the world so far that have moved to plain packaging: Australia, France, and the UK. UK is still pretty new, but based on everything that we have heard and dealing with our counterparts in Australia, for example, they have doubled the amount of border security because they have noticed that there has been. So we're not saying that there's a direct cause and effect. We are saying, based on what we have heard from these 3 countries who didn't have as big a contraband problem as we have here in Canada. And I think that's important.
Yes,
right?
but you say, I hate to cut you off because I've got limited time here. I've got limited time here. But again, this was data from the Department of Public Health in Australia that has said that this was one of the contributing factors to decreasing smoking. And in fact, this study you're referring to seems to fly in the face of the majority of evidence. Again, we're talking over 100 papers by independent peer-reviewed scientific organizations that are saying that this does not, in fact, decrease or increase contraband tobacco. To say that since this happened, well, they're paying more for border security. Again, it's no more than correlation, and it's so many steps removed from it. I don't know how we can make a conclusion from this.
So we'd be happy to share the exact data that we retrieved from the government of Australia, and we'd be happy to present that to the committee.
All right, thank you very much. We'd appreciate receiving that information. And now, let's go on to vaping. Mrs. Kothawala, you talked about vaping being a safe alternative to cigarettes. Safer. Yeah, pardon me, thank you. Yeah, safer alternative to cigarettes. A study in the Canadian Medical Association Journal said that young people who started off using vaping were significantly more likely to then go on to smoking tobacco. So even if the actual substance itself, if it's all you smoke, may not be as dangerous, would this not be a significant danger that by someone starting using this product, going on to tobacco, would indirectly make it a very dangerous product?
Well, I think what we're saying is that both with respect to cigarettes, and I appreciate what Freeze the Industry is talking about, both with respect to cigarettes and with respect to vaping, our point is that if young people want to access either of these products, they can access these products. In the case of vape, it's from the illegal vape shops, where we have followed the law. Health Canada had a directive that we could not sell, so distributors and retailers did not sell those products. Meanwhile, we're competing with the illegal shops, and they're cropping up on every street corner. So we're saying, if that's going to continue to happen, then there should be a level playing field. And by the way, we have a very strong track record in checking for ID. So young people don't develop their smoking habit based on buying cigarettes in convenience stores.
All right, time's up. Now we go to Ms. Finley. Welcome to our committee.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start, if I may, with Dr. Davidson. Dr. Davidson, could you tell us about the illegal tobacco market in Australia? Do you grow tobacco there? Are the products counterfeit, or are they contraband? Are they domestically produced or brought in from outside the country?
No legal tobacco is grown in Australia. There used to be tobacco licenses for farming here in Victoria, where I live, and I think Over the last 10 years, the government have been buying back the licenses, so there is no legal tobacco produced in Australia. Any tobacco produced in Australia must be illegally grown, or it is imported into the country either as illicit or as contraband. And we have both types where people buy legal tobacco in neighbouring countries, import it into the country, and or they actually counterfeit cigarettes. So we have both. The KPMG UK does an annual survey, and they estimate that the size of the illicit markets, or the illegal market, has grown from about 11% before the policy was introduced to about 13-14% now, which, depending upon the precise numbers, is about a 20 to 25% increase in the illegal markets in Australia. Now, bearing in mind, Australia is an island, so it's actually quite hard to get stuff to us. There's also been talk that a lot of people have stopped smuggling more dangerous types of drugs and are substituting for tobacco simply because the penalties of smuggling tobacco are so much lower than the penalties of smuggling harder drugs. So you might even say that could be a positive, I suppose, except, of course, to the people who are competing against criminals. There's been an increase in theft from convenience stores where people are now breaking in and stealing tobacco products. So convenience stores are now having to compete against their own stolen products, which is, of course, grossly unfair to them. And certainly there's also been a policy disconnect because we have illegal tobacconists setting up all over the place. But between the customs people, the local police, the local councils who are supposed to license all of this, there doesn't seem to be a clear pathway of responsibility to be policing the illegal market. So one of the other recommendations I should make now that I'm thinking about it is that the Canadian government should actually create clear lines of responsibility for enforcing the plain packaging laws, because otherwise it ends up falling between the cracks where everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else. There was another point I was going to make, but it escapes me for the minute.
Are you at all familiar with the contraband situation in Canada and North America?
I have some familiarity with it, and that was the other point I wanted to make. Our native title here in Australia is very different from native title in North America. So we can't actually have situations where Australian Aboriginal people grow tobacco on their lands and then sell it into the rest of Australia, which I understand can happen in North America. So in the United States, and I think also in Canada, that is a situation. I also understand that the illegal market in Canada is so much bigger than what it is here in Australia.
Exactly. In fact, it's conservatively estimated at between 20 and 30% of the market. Some areas as high as 80%. It's a very serious issue. It's not just that, oh, well, these are dirty cigarettes or they're cheap cigarettes. The money is as has been mentioned earlier, is actually tied to international organized crime and is often used to launder money, because it's easier to drive a big truck full of cartons of cigarettes across the Canada-U.S. border than it is to transport hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars of cash. So this is big business. It's big money.
And the point to understand is that this actually becomes a subsidy to criminality, which, of course, in and of itself is always bad policy. Now, I like to make the point that criminality itself is a gateway drug to further criminality, because criminals do not pay taxes, they do not pay dividends, they do not employ under minimum employment standards, they engage in violence, they increase insurance costs, they subvert social institutions, and they compete unfairly with legal business. I mean, all round, criminality is a serious problem that needs to be suppressed and certainly not subsidized, even when you've got the best of intentions.
And that's my big fear with this bill, is that it's going to be one of the best pieces of good news that the contraband industry in this country could ever get. Thank you very much, Dr. Davidson. I have a question for Freeze. You say that you want to help people quit smoking, or to get, obviously, if we're going to get to 535, a lot of people are going to have to quit. Would it be helpful if they knew what alternatives were available to them, Mr. Johnson?
I think, yes, it would be helpful to know what safer alternatives there are to use out there. Obviously, people can't, all people can cut cold turkey. But in addition to, for getting 5 under 35, it's not just about getting people to quit smoking.
But that was the question. You agree they should. Yet this bill, S5, would not allow any products that are safer, that are determined to be safer, that are logically safer, to advertise that fact. So anyone who is wanting to quit can't be told, unless it's by Health Canada, what the alternatives are.
And I agree with Health Canada that Health Canada should be the only regulatory body to determine whether or not it is a safer alternative and pass on that messaging through their packages or whatever they deem appropriate.
The Health Canada does not send messages to people on the street. People on the street aren't reading those messages, that's for sure. But for a product, if some food products can advertise that they have less fat or fewer carbs or whatever, and yet we're talking about a major health issue here. Mm-hmm. And with this bill, a smoker would not be able to look at advertising, to do their research, to find out what the products would be that would help them. They'd have to rely on a physician who would not be able to do that research either, because Health Canada would be the only one that would have that information. Do you think that that's right?
It still stands on our position that we would support Health Canada distributing that sort of messaging and making sure that that gets across clearly, but not the responsibility of tobacco companies or e-cigarette companies or whatever to advertise that to their consumers.
Okay, thanks very much. Time's up. Now, Mr. Davies, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Luongo, you referred to your claim that you'd like the industry to move to IQOS, the electronic pen-like, and made some claims about it being safer. I'm reading a New York Times article from January 25th, 2018, about 2.5 weeks ago. And it says a federal advisory committee on Thursday recommended that the Food and Drug Administration reject a bid by Philip Morris International. That's your parent company, is it?
Yes, that's correct.
To market a smokeless tobacco stick in the United States as safer than traditional cigarettes. It said in an 8-to-1 vote, the advisory panel rejected the company's contention that, quote, scientific studies have shown that switching completely from cigarettes to the IQOS system can reduce the risk of tobacco-related diseases, end quote. It says the panel also expressed doubt that smokers would completely switch to use of the stick, saying many might become long-term dual users of the device in traditional cigarettes. It said the committee did agree that the heated product would limit exposure to harmful chemicals in conventional cigarettes. So I put it to you, sir, that the FDA panel has, so far at least, rejected your claim before this committee that IQOS, that system reduced the risk of tobacco-related diseases. Isn't that what they found?
Well, I think you need to differentiate between two things. Number one is whether they felt that there was enough evidence to make certain recommendations on specific language and what that underlying evidence showed and what the discussion of that committee showed. Mm-hmm. And I think there was a lot of actual positive discussion if you had watched the 2 days worth of committee hearings. And clearly, this is an advisory panel. The FDA is now going to make its determination. The FDA has actually not made a determination on the application yet, but we were actually very encouraged by all of the feedback that came from the committee in total.
Okay. I wanted to go to the Canadian Convenience Stores Association and ask you, are tobacco companies members of your association?
As I mentioned in my opening remarks, they are in fact non-voting members of our association.
Okay, and how much funding does the tobacco industry give to your organization and to your regional affiliates, such as the Ontario and Atlantic Convenience Stores Association?
We don't divulge our financial information.
You don't divulge how much money the tobacco company, so I don't know how much money you're receiving from the tobacco industry.
We don't divulge any financial information that our members provide us with.
Why not, sir?
It's a long-standing policy that we've had with our members. It's not just tobacco; it's also confectionery, beverages, and I might note that it's virtually unheard of that associations provide that type of information.
Back to Mr. Luongo. We heard some evidence about contraband. My understanding is the three major tobacco companies in Canada, including your company, were convicted of being engaged in illegal contraband in 2008. And you were required to pay fines and civil payments totaling $1.7 billion. So my question is, what was the behavior or action that was undertaken by the tobacco companies that led to those convictions?
Well, look, to start, just to be clear, I was not at RBH at the time. And the reality was at the time, and this actually, even though this occurred in 2008, you're talking about behavior that had taken place many years before.
My question is, what was the behavior that led to the conviction?
My understanding is that, and you can look to the specific settlement that was reached, but that there was product that was coming out of Canada into the U.S. and back into Canada.
So the tobacco industry comes to this committee and says, don't bring in plain packaging, don't increase health warnings, because you're going to have an increase in contraband. And the whole time, the tobacco industry is actually conspiring with the contraband industry to actually participate in the sale and promotion of contraband material?
Well, I'm sorry, there are two things. Number one...
Well, there's more than two things there.
Well, at least. But number one, we're not coming to the committee to talk about plain packaging. That's not our focus for today. Our focus is on doing the right things for Canadian smokers.
Okay.
Number two, I think it's important that we look at what the state of the industry is today and not talk about things that happened decades ago.
So can I clarify then, given that your company, as you said, wants to end the sale of cigarettes, then do you support plain packaging for cigarettes?
We don't think it is effective, but it is not something that we're opposing.
Okay. I want to go to Freeze the Industry. Thank you for your testimony. I think it's so important to hear from young people because, as we heard, most people who get addicted to cigarettes start young, probably before the age of 18. So I noticed on your website you said plain packaging is good, but plain and standard is better. Can you explain the difference between the two?
Yes, and I'm glad you asked the question because we have some samples of tobacco products here today. We want all packaging to be plain and standard in that it has the full thing is it has the health warning, but that it's all slide-in shelf. Yeah, slide-in shelf, not flip top, not anything else. So all tobacco products would be slide-in shell because when you have different products, you could have the health warning here, but with a product like this, there's branding on the back, all along the sides. When you open the product itself, you see more branding on the inside. Same with this one, and that health warning that was mandated to be on there, you're only seeing it here, but it's not on the rest of the product itself. Take again the Vogue Slims. You see the warning here, all around. Even when you open it up, there's advertising, and this one actually particularly smells nice as well.
Okay. Can I ask a question among your peers? Are you aware of any of your peers starting with vaping that ultimately switched to smoking cigarettes?
Absolutely. Yes, certainly. The current perception in my knowledge as to vaping is that it's harmless and safer than smoking. It's certainly safer is a big word. I think we need more evidence-based fact. And it's true that once they start vaping, they're more likely to start smoking later on in their lives.
Time's up. Okay, now we go to Mr. Oliver.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Luongo, so one of your representatives was in to see me in my office in Oakville before this meeting, just to let me know what some of your issues were. And he asked me to consider 20.1. No person shall promote a tobacco product, including by means of packaging, in a manner that could cause a person to believe the product or its emissions are less harmful than other tobacco products or their emissions, and was making the case that you should be able to advertise new products that have lower nicotine or lower risks of smoking than cigarettes, and making the case for that. So it made me think to do some research into nicotine. I found this. This was research from 2016. There's an increased risk of nicotine poses health hazards. There's an increased risk of cardiovascular, respiratory, gastrointestinal disorders, decreased immune response, and it also poses ill impacts on reproductive health. It affects cell proliferation, oxidative stress, apoptosis, DNA mutation by various mechanisms that leads to cancer. It affects tumor proliferation and metastasis and causes resistance to chemo and radiotherapeutic agents. The use of nicotine needs regulation. The sale of nicotine should be under supervision of trained medical personnel. So I remain convinced that our goal as a health committee is to get nicotine and addiction to nicotine out of our society. What struck me, though, was that this was the Indian Journal of Medical and Pediatric Oncology, and I thought to myself, India's not known for high smoking rates. So I then went on and did a bit more research, and I found this. The tobacco giant Philip, this is from an article in this last summer, July 2017. The tobacco giant is pushing Marlboros in colorful ads at kiosks and handing out free smokes at parties frequented by young adults, tactics to break India's anti-smoking laws. In internal documents, Philip Morris International is explicit about targeting the country's youth. A key goal is winning the hearts and minds of legal age 18 and 24 citizens, according to one slide in a 2015 commercial review presentation. Philip Morris's marketing strategy for India relies heavily on kiosk advertising and social events, and it was laid out in hundreds of pages of internal documents reviewed by Reuters that covered the period up to 2016. In targeting young adults, Philip Morris is deploying a promotional strategy that it and other tobacco companies used in the United States decades ago. A study published in the American Journal of Public Health in 2002 found that during the 1990s, tobacco industry sponsorship of bars, nightclubs increased dramatically, accompanied by cigarette brand paraphernalia, advertisements, and entertainment events in bars and clubs. With cigarette sales declining in many countries, Philip Morris has identified India, population 1.3 billion, as a market with opportunity for significant growth. India remains a high potential market with huge upside with the cigarette market still in its infancy. Did you lie to the committee when you said Philip Morris wants out of the cigarette business?
Absolutely not. I think it's pretty clear that, number one, when you talk about the risks of nicotine, we've always said that nicotine is not risk-free, but you have to look at the continuum of risk. And that's the whole point of...
So you're targeting in 2016 a $1.3 billion population geared to addicting them to cigarettes. So sometime between 2016 and today, at this committee, Philip Morris decided to get out of its sale of cigarettes?
Well, let's be very clear. Our goal is to stop selling cigarettes. I'm not going to speak to the committee about things that may or may not have happened in India.
Are they happening today in India? Are you trying to addict?
I'm the managing director.
This isn't some foreign place. My neighbors, my friends, my constituents are from India. They have relatives, they have mums and sons and daughters that live in India. I view these as my friends and family. Are you is Philip Morris International attempting to addict Indians to cigarettes?
I can't speak on behalf of Philip Morris other than to say that we
you
always
did. You said
adhere.
Philip Morris wants out of selling cigarettes, so you did speak for them.
Yes, because that is something that is publicly stated, and I can say that Philip Morris always adheres to the highest ethical standards when marketing and selling their products. And the only thing that we are asking for here in Canada is to tell smokers factual information about the products that they can choose between.
So you're moving away from cigarettes, but you're still working to addict Canadians to nicotine.
We are trying to switch people who already smoke, who already, based on everything we know, are at high risk of disease, to go to alternatives that are potentially less risky.
So we've undertaken massive regulation and restrictions on your industry to stop targeting kids, to stop targeting young people so that they don't get addicted to begin with. So now you're left with the population of people that you did get addicted, and you're now trying to find new ways of keeping them addicted to nicotine instead of finding ways to help them stop smoking. Have you thought about working with the government to fund an anti-smoking program? Would Philip Morris support funding? When I was growing up as a kid, we used to see lots of advertising and government promotion about the dangers of smoking and stop smoking and don't get addicted to cigarettes. That's kind of gone now, and the risks of nicotine and the public awareness of the risks of nicotine has subsided, and now we're seeing with new devices like vaping and your heat, not burn models, making nicotine seem okay again when it's not. So would you help sponsor a government program to fight, to continue to educate Canadians about the risks of nicotine and why it's important they don't get addicted to it?
Well, I think that there are a lot of things that we could look at funding together. I mean, you can look at education, you can look at research that's independently verified on these new products to address Mr. Elfson's concern. I think that there are many things that can be done, and today the government does collect billions of dollars in taxes from the industry that should be going to address these concerns. I think education is always a good thing for consumers.
Okay, so I just want to say again, I said it this morning, I think when we look at 100,000 new smokers, new daily smokers a day in Canada, new daily smokers a year in Canada, so 100,000, 82% of new smokers in Canada are 18 years or under. Our problem right now, I believe, is stopping people from starting to get addicted to nicotine, starting to take on smoking. So I support anything in S5 that continues and putting stronger language on the vaping side to make sure that the same restrictions on vaping advertising are in place for tobacco that they match. I think is a really important thing for S5 to be doing. So I just wanted to move over to Mr. Johnson and your testimony.
Just very quickly.
Okay, quick. Is there anything, do you think there's a need for another public campaign on the risks of nicotine and cigarette smoking?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand, yes, that it's not just the tobacco, it's also the nicotine. It's the nicotine that goes to the brain and gets you addicted, makes you feel good, and then you want another hit and another hit and another hit. So it's important to understand, but it's also important to understand when you inform the public that tobacco and smoking and tobacco usage, it's not normal. So we're in the practice of tobacco industry denormalization, so making something that seems normal not normal. It's not normal to use a product that when used as intended will cause bodily harm or cause death. It's not normal to do that, and I think it's important for not only young Canadians, whether 18 and under or between 18 and 24, but for their parents to also understand that so that they can guide and best raise their children to be healthy and productive Canadians.
Okay, thanks very much. And now that completes our 7-minute round. We're going to go to our 5-minute round. We're going to start with Ms. Klander.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. My first question, I think I'll start with Satinder, Chera. You talked about how the convenience stores are not allowed to participate in the vaping industry. One of the testimonies that we heard was that it's important that people are instructed on how to use the vaping devices, and how will you address that if your industry is allowed to participate?
So first of all, just I'd like to make the point that my colleague made earlier, which is that we have proactively abided by Health Canada's regulations around ensuring that convenience stores not sell vape products with nicotine. We will be more than happy to share with the committee the materials that we've distributed to our members. We certainly stand to be partners with the government. We are today in ensuring that young people don't get their hands on tobacco products. We have an excellent track record, as witnessed through Smoke Free Ontario. They've done their own test, if you will, and they've concluded that convenience stores are a trusted source of providing tobacco through legal means. And so when it comes to vape, certainly our recommendation is that if the government is going to go down this road, that convenience stores should be looked at as a partner to dispense those products, which again we look at. There is growing acknowledgement out there that vape may be a safe alternative, and certainly we think that our channel should be looked at very seriously.
Okay, very good, thanks. Now, Phrase the Industry, I want to ask you about something. Obviously, you're against people smoking, which is great. And I wondered, with the legalization of marijuana only in the smoked form, we're seeing that's that's happening, and I'd like to know what you think about that. I also want to know what you think about vaping, since people are not just vaping nicotine products, they're vaping marijuana, and it's been shown that young people are vaping, and they're twice as likely then to start smoking something. So if you could comment on that.
Right now, the mandate to freeze the industry is to make sure that young people, don't take up smoking. And because perhaps vaping can be that sort of gateway, and combine it with marijuana and all that, could contribute to increase in smoking rates, then we believe that it should not be allowed to happen. And of course, that's the position that the industry is willing to take on that. But we can't comment on specific matters regards to that. But of course, we still believe that young people should not be in the business of trying to kill themselves by smoking.
Great. And for Dr. Davidson, I have a question for you. You mentioned something about the importance of excise pricing and public education in with respect to the implementations in Australia. Could you elaborate?
When looking at smoking prevalence, two things stand out. First of all, in developed countries, smoking prevalence has been falling for decades. What really stands out is that price increases through excise taxation and public education as to the harms of smoking have probably had the single largest public health impacts in Australia, probably Canada, all over the developed world as well. And so my argument is that if the Canadian government genuinely wants to do something about smoking prevalence, they should focus their efforts on excise tax, public education, information, and also, let me say, substitutes to smoking as well. It seems a lot of the debate that I've been hearing this morning seems to have this idea that there's good nicotine and bad nicotine comes from the tobacco industry. But there are substitutes in terms of gums, vapors, that were provided by the pharmaceutical industry that are actually tax advantaged in most countries. And there's talk about banning vaping. Now, all these products deliver nicotine and should be treated equally, taxed equally, and put onto a level playing field. Now, excise increases in Australia, there have been 2 rounds of 50% increases phased in over 4 years since 2013. We're still in the second round right now. And there's also automatic indexation to weekly earnings. So every 6 months, excise tobacco gets increased by whatever the index amount on weekly earnings. It used to be CPI, but that was felt the CPI was not keeping track of actually purchasing power.
Okay, thanks very much. And now we go to Ms. Sidhu.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for all the witnesses. Removing brand elements led you to be less interested in tobacco, and even found that they were more likely to have a negative expectation of the taste of tobacco. Certainly, if this practice reduces the appeal of smoking to youth, we can reduce the number of young Canadians who take up smoking. Could you comment on this finding to freeze the industry? How we can reduce smoking cessation in youth?
I think it's important to understand that we are not against the smokers, we're against the industry. We want youth and young adults to be informed of how the industry targets them. We want them to be informed and understand what the product does when used, and we want them to have the tools and resources to be able to resist this manipulative marketing. And so I think it's important to first limit the industry in totality in its ability to advertise and target youth and young adults. That's step number one. Step number two is to really have youth and young adults understand what a cigarette is, or what tobacco products are, or what happens when they use them, but also allow them to understand that they have great freedom right now. They don't have to worry about emphysema or heart failure or any of these diseases that afflict other people, unfortunately, and help them understand how the use of tobacco causes that, and then also understand that there's no such thing as good nicotine and bad nicotine. Nicotine is nicotine. It's a drug. It's an addictive drug. When you use it, you get happy in the head, and then again and again and again, and as people have seen, when you get addicted to a drug, life doesn't tend to go up, it tends to go down.
And you said McMaster University became smoke-free.
Yes.
What kind of the public education campaign you need to do?
So with McMaster tobacco smoke-free policy, tobacco-free, sorry, it means that there are no tobacco products sold on campus and tobacco can't be used on campus. And so what McMaster is undertaking is that between now and March, it's a soft launch, meaning that if people are found to be using tobacco products on campus, they will be asked to leave campus and use it elsewhere. After that, there will be a hard implementation. In addition to that, they'll also letting the McMaster community know that indigenous use of tobacco for sacred purposes will be allowed, because we don't want to hinder on that culture. Furthermore, the McMaster is also working with its local neighborhood to ensure that the amount of the people who would usually smoke on campus don't end up going to smoke in these neighborhoods and cause smoking to be more in these neighborhoods that are so beautiful. Lastly, the McMaster community has committed a considerable amount of resources to help its staff, students, faculty members, and any person who may want to quit smoking to access those resources, and they're working hand in hand with Hamilton Public Health to really make that happen.
Okay.
Can I? Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Just can I add something? During the summer, at Freeze the Industry, we held a sort of like a playing party, or like a sort of like an educational night for just our local communities. I went to a ice cream shop, and we stood outside, and we basically educated the people that walked by, especially the youth, about the benefits of plain and standardized packaging. We showed them how appealing and attractive different types of cigarette packages can be. Like, for example, you've seen this one at the last committee. This is the Vogue, the Slim Pack, which makes young women who are vulnerable to this kind of social pressure to fit in, to look like X, Y, Z stereotype or whatnot. They would be led to think that, hey, if I took this sort of cigarette and within this sort of branding and packaging, then I would look like the ideal person that I want to be. While in reality, it might just make you end up looking worse. But the point is that when we showed these young people what the new sort of packages would hopefully look like, they said, I don't want to hold this. I don't want to be seen holding this. I don't want to smoke this. I want nothing to do with this. And just now, when I'm holding this right now, yes?
Oh, thanks.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
My next question is Benson and Hedges. Your company saw super slim cigarettes, showing that, which is very attractive to fashionable and attracting the women's. And don't you think this type of cigarettes are more attracting to the youth?
I don't think that type of packaging is the reason that people smoke. I think making the decision to smoke is a much bigger decision than which brand you smoke. At the same time, the reason that I did not speak about plain packaging in my remarks is that, frankly, while there are negative impacts in terms of contraband, it's not going to have the impact that you think it will on public health. Just look at super slim cigarettes. They're not a large portion of the market. Even if they disappeared tomorrow, it's not going to get you to 5 by 35. If we look at Japan is the best example, because we've had heat not burn products there the longest. Cigarette consumption went down by 10% last year in Japan. I will bet anyone on the committee $100 that the year after plain packaging comes into play in Canada, cigarette consumption will not go down by 10%. It's a question of what are the most effective strategies. So I think there are things that are being done on the margin, which we can debate, but I don't think they're going to get you to the goal that you want, which is really to reduce the diseases associated with smoking.
Okay, thanks very much. Now we go to Ms. Kuzi.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Chair, would you say that it is difficult to differentiate between plain packaging and contraband packaging? And if so, can you please describe some of the similarities between the two types of packaging, please?
When you look at the two brands, what ends up happening is that both the legal and the illegal, you'd have same characteristics, like you'd have the same color size, you'd have the same font size, which would make it absolutely difficult for law enforcement to decipher whether or not it is a legal product or an illegal product. We already know that there is a thriving contraband market in Canada, in Ontario, and some communities up near 60 to 70%. And our view is that with plain packaging, you're essentially giving a blueprint to criminals to continue to grow the contraband market.
Would you say the same would be for consumers in addition to law enforcers? That it would be difficult for them to differentiate the difference between the two?
I would say yes, and this is one of the reasons that we talk about that when you take away brand identifiers, then the only real difference left is price, and there's just virtually no way a law-abiding convenience store can compete with the black market. Convenience store operators, the legal tobacco products, 70% of them is tax alone. And then on top of that, you add overhead, wages, and so forth. There's no way that they can compete with the illegal market where, frankly, they don't have to worry about paying government taxes.
Mr. Chair, do you know how much tax revenue is lost on an annual basis due to missed revenue of contraband cigarettes?
We've seen estimates out there. There's one report, I think the McDonald Institute put out that had about a figure about $3 billion.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. With 29 billion cigarettes sold in 2014, estimating that that's only 70% of the market, an additional 30% of the market would be 12 billion, and at 16.475 cents per cigarette, I think that's a lot of money we could have saved with the small business tax changes, eh, ladies? Wouldn't you say so? So thank you very much for those estimates. Mr. Luongo, why would you say that the proposed taxes on marijuana are so much considerably lower than those that are presently on cigarettes?
Honestly, I wish I knew. It's not something that we have an official position on. Our perspective is that, taxation should be based on risk, not just the history of why we are where we are today. And I think that whichever product you're looking at, you should look at taxation based on the risk to the consumer. And that's both within nicotine and tobacco containing products, so when you're looking at e-cigarettes versus cigarettes, but it's also across the whole spectrum of products that consumers use.
Yeah, and further to that, yes, please do, Ms. Kothawala.
I think it's an important question because it's precisely, you have from the Prime Minister on down, Prime Minister, several ministers who have actually said that the whole rationale behind ensuring that there's not huge tax on cannabis when it becomes legal is in fact to avoid growth of the black market. So we are left asking ourselves, why is the same logic not being applied to tobacco?
Yeah, and I think it's pretty rich for our committee to potentially accuse one of our guests and invitees here today to be lying and killing off people. And I'm certain we could say the same about alcohol or opioids or coffee eventually, for that matter. So following up on that question, Mr. Luongo, do you see contraband tobacco actors moving into the marijuana industry as well? Do you think that this is something that is potentially at risk in the future?
I'm not the expert on their business strategy, but it seems pretty logical.
Yeah, I would say so. Mr. Chera, could you comment on that, the potential of contraband tobacco actors moving into the marijuana industry as well eventually?
Well, I think if the government pursues its approach to ensure that pricing isn't way out of whack with the underground economy, then perhaps they'll avoid that problem. And that's essentially the point that my colleague made, is that if they apply that logic to cannabis, then why not apply it to tobacco, where in fact we already know we have a thriving contraband market that the RCMP has already talked about, illegal factories in Canada that are pumping out the illegal packages. So why not apply that logic to both products going forward?
It would seem to me that it would be reasonable of the government to apply the same standards for both industries. Finally, Mr. Chair, can you explain where profits from contraband cigarettes go, as far as you know?
Profits from contraband cigarettes?
Correct.
To the pockets of criminals?
The pockets of criminals. So you would say things such as organized crime, human trafficking, terrorism, perhaps even relating to the First World Trade Center bombing. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
So I guess I would respond to that. I think in our presentation we had a specific quote from a recent from the RCMP that specifically talked about the connection between criminal elements and contraband.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Ayoub.
Thank you. Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to read a brief summary of the bill.
Friends are getting their translation. Because my question would be in French because I've got only 5 minutes and I'm talking a little bit faster in French. So, and if you may just start it.
So if everybody's plugged in the right channel, thank you all. I'm going to wait till Mr. Okay, so I'm giving you a recap of what the law S5. It's pretty quick. We are going to rename this at Tobacco and Vaping Products Act and take the provisions to protect individuals against dependency on nicotine and the use of tobacco, to allow adults access to vaping products as an alternative, less damaging, less harm reduction than tobacco, in order to protect the health and safety of Canadians by way of a variety of means. So I'll stop at that point. That's the summary, the objective, and we have on one side of the table talking about the health of Canadians and a concern for public health in Canada, and on the other hand, we're talking a business case. Now, I'm somewhat concerned about that. We hear from representatives of industry from face it, both sides of the mouth, and credibility is a feature, is an issue here. You have to convince me, Mr. Luongo, that you really wish to put an end to smoking or tobacco products. How much are you prepared to invest to shut down the industry? I don't think you're investing to shut down. I think you should be investing in means to fund clinics for smoke cessation programs. However, now, and I say our friends, the retail representatives, convenience stores, you're kind of caught in a crossfire. You're doing very good work insofar as the ID program, age verification. But at the same time, you don't want to tell us to what degree you might be influenced by the industry. The funding information you don't want to share. That puts you in a pretty tough spot. The credibility might be at risk here. And you'll have to convince me a little bit more by sharing a little bit more. Now, for politicians, you know, credibility is all. We are judged on our credibility, and we have no room for maneuver in that. You have more. Now, for the young volunteers, Freeze the Industry, who are working on a shoestring budget, and they have, of course, the health of Canadians at heart, what in Bill S5 appeals to you, and what would you change in order that this Bill S5 would improve the health status of Canadians, from your perspective, so that they would not start smoking and or end smoking? Freeze the Industry agrees with S5, particularly in that it's going to standardize and the plain packaging. And I think it's important for young adults to be aware of the secondary effects of smoking and smoke. And young people are very exposed and vulnerable to stress and groupthink and peer pressure. And they're very vulnerable to begin smoking if they see others do it. So standardizing plain packaging would prevent the recruitment of new smokers by improving the health warnings, for example, on the package, by removing the glamour and the lifestyle appeal of the packaging. If I can sort of go along the same line of thought as my colleague, these health messages being more evident, bolder on the packages, would give youth a greater opportunity, youth who are already hooked on nicotine, to perhaps seek out alternatives to try to put an end to their dependency and addiction. So what we're suggesting is the implementation of this plain and standardized packaging, minimize all branding and marketing that's addressed at youth, and improve the health of young Canadians.
Or did you want to hear what we have to say? Because you're suggesting that we only care about the business interests. That's it. Well, you know what? We actually care about the health and safety of particularly young people, which is why, and you rightly point out, that we have a very solid track record. Mm-hmm. I think what is the fundamental issue here is that we have not seen one piece of research other than what people think that the attractiveness, and I really fail to see how a 75% health warning package that is kept behind a flap in a convenience store is something that is driving young people to take up smoking. Okay? So that's the first issue. Secondly, I think we are not here today to say we only care about the business interests of the convenience store industry. We just want to sell more cigarettes. That's not what we've said. We have said, based on everything that we have seen, plain packaging, there is no research to support that plain packaging will actually achieve the government's objectives, which is to reduce smoking.
Time's up. Thanks very much. Mr. Davies.
Well, thank you. I'll pick up that last point. I beg to differ, Ms. Kothawala. I mean, there's compelling evidence, including extensive studies supporting implementation of plain packaging. An updated March 2014 evidentiary overview reviewed 75 empirical studies. That was prepared by University of Waterloo Professor David Hammond for the Irish government. In the United Kingdom, the Chandler Review and the Sterling Review provided extensive evidence to the same effect. A special issue of the journal Tobacco Control was published in April 2015 with a series of studies on the Australian experience, providing yet further evidence. And I'm going to quote, this is maybe for you and for Mr. Davidson. I did some research while I was listening. It says, this is from Australia, the department commenced a post-implementation review of tobacco plain packaging in December 2014 in accordance with the Australian government's best practice regulation process. The purpose of a PIR is to assess whether a regulation remains appropriate and how effective and efficient the regulation has been in meeting its objectives. The PIR was published in the Office of Best Practices Regulation website on February 26, 2016. The PIR concludes that the tobacco plain packaging measure has begun to achieve its public health objectives of reducing smoking and exposure to tobacco smoke in Australia, and it is expected to continue to do so into the future. The body of studies considered for the PIR show that the tobacco plain packaging measure is having an impact by reducing the appeal of tobacco products, increasing the effectiveness of health warnings, and reducing the ability of the pack to mislead. The studies also provide early evidence of positive changes to actual smoking and quitting behaviors. The available studies are diverse, peer-reviewed, and published in leading medical journals. I could go on. Do you still say, Ms. Kothawala, that there's no empirical evidence to show that plain packaging is effective?
I have seen nothing in the last, anything that we have seen has talked about how it has not led to a decrease in smoking and it has led to an increase in contraband. Those are the two fundamental issues that we're looking at, and we're saying if, in fact, plain packaging achieves the objectives, then...
Mr. Chair, I just want to turn... Oh, Ms. Davidson...
can I respond?
Just to... Give me 1 second. I'll come right back to you. Mr. Chera, you said you had an estimate on the amount of tax dollars that were saved. Do you have any idea how much money the consumption of tobacco costs the Canadian health care system?
Not aware of that number, no, sir.
That number you don't know. So all the people that die, 50% of tobacco consumers in this country are going to die of a tobacco-related illness. Heard that earlier. You have no idea how much that costs our public taxpayer.
I do not.
No. Mr. Davidson, you wanted to respond to what I quoted from the Australian review?
Yes. First of all, the study in the tobacco control issue of 2015, my colleague and I did an extensive analysis of that of those papers, and the Cancer Council of Victoria, which undertook the original research, responded with a press release saying that that survey was, and I quote, quite explicitly not designed to assess quitting success or change in smoking prevalence, but rather focused on the immediate impact of the legislation. So all of those studies in the tobacco control don't do what you just quoted them to have done, and the authors of their studies actually said that. Turning to the PIR, which is a very, very impressive econometric technique undertaken, what happened there is that the PIR found that there was a 0.55% decline in smoking prevalence as a result of the plain packaging policy. What the PIR did not report was that the sample error in their study was bigger than the policy effect size that they found. The other thing that is not clear from the study is the person that they modeled in terms of smoking was an unmarried Australian-born 14 to 17-year-old male with a tertiary qualification, employed full-time, but with an income of less than $6,000 and living in Victoria. Now, no such person exists. So it is unsurprising that when you model a person who does not exist, whether or not they gave up smoking, and your effect is smaller than the sample error in your data, that you would want to keep that a bit quiet. The other thing is that their pseudo R-squareds were less than 10%. So while the analysis was very clever, it excluded price, it's entirely, utterly unconvincing.
Okay, thanks very much, Dr. Davison. Now that completes our normal round, but by popular demand, we're going to go into overtime again like we did this morning. We're going to have one round of questions, 4 minutes each, and I ask you to keep them to 4 minutes. It'll be the same order as this morning, but we're going to start with Mr. McKinnon, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Mr. Luongo. So you said that your corporate goals, you share the goal of reducing cigarette use in Canada, and you have the ultimate objective to stop selling cigarettes. So you anticipated the obvious question there is why don't you stop by saying, well, people just switch to a competitor. So my question is, why do you care? If this is a market you're willing to get out of, why do you care if you're losing market share to somebody else? Why don't you take your corporate resources that you're currently investing in manufacture, sale, and whatnot of cigarettes and put them towards a product that you feel is a safer product, such as IQOS, for example?
Well, that's exactly what we're doing. We are shifting our resources. We're massively shifting all of our activities over to these new products. But it takes a lot of money. It took a ton of money for these products to be developed, to do the research and development on them. You know, we had the discussion in terms of the scientific evidence on these products earlier. All of that takes hundreds of millions of dollars a year at the PMI level to do. So for us to stop selling, we would actually lose all of the resources, all of our people, because we wouldn't be able to afford them without selling cigarettes. We need to make this transition. We need to do it as quickly as possible, but it's not something that can happen overnight, and it's a place where policy plays a role. That's why we're looking for your help.
So I guess what I'm hearing from your answer then is that the reason you don't stop now is not because your competition will take over the market, but because you're using that market to fund your transition. Would that be fair?
It's a combination. It would have no impact on public health in terms of a positive impact if we were to just stop selling unilaterally. People would go to our competitors, they would go to the black market. And at the same time, we wouldn't have the infrastructure and the resources in order to commercialize these products.
But I guess it does go to credibility to say that you believe we should stop selling cigarettes, but we're going to keep doing it because we need to. I think it undermines credibility. But I'll leave that for now. I guess the other question I have, one of the concerns that one of our earlier panelists had was that the regulatory framework around vaping that we're putting into S5 will basically mean that the tobacco industry will kind of invade that market and take it over. Do you see vaping as a growth market for you?
I think vaping is a market that we would certainly look at competing in if it were legalized. I don't think it's a question of it being a growth market per se, but I think that the more people we can switch from cigarettes to whatever alternative product it is, whether it's heated tobacco, whether it's vaping, I think those are all good things. So there's no reason why we wouldn't compete in that industry once it's legalized.
Yes, one final question. It has to do with plain packaging. You say that doesn't work, yet you're investing money, of course, in packaging for IQOS and so forth. IQOS. If packaging has no effect, why would you be investing all this money in packaging and promoting and developing a new brand? I'm sure there's a great lot of money involved in developing the packaging, the what it looks like, and the impression that it gets on the marketplace. If plain packaging has no effect on the market, I'm wondering what effect why would you be spending money on non-plain plain packaging?
Well, I guess two parts to the answer, and I'll be quick. In terms of within combustible cigarettes, it goes to a lot of what was discussed earlier in terms of brand preference. And once someone decides to smoke, having them choose your brand rather than your competitor, and having the products be able to be differentiated from a consumer standpoint so that people know what a legal product and what is not a legal product. In terms of IQOS specifically, the packaging there is actually relatively simple. I can hold up the pack if you don't mind, but I mean, this is the pack. There is a color on the top, but the rest of the pack is essentially black and white. We are much more focused on explaining to people what this product is and what it is not than we are on things that may have been done in the past.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we go to Ms. Gladu, 4 minutes.
Chair, and I'm going to split my time with Ms. Finley. Professor Davidson, I have a question for you. I'm trying to get at the heart of the issue. We've heard testimony that plain packaging works, and we've heard testimony that plain packaging doesn't work, and there seems to be reports on all sides. But we did see data from Australia that is the longest having implemented this. We know that France, Japan, and the UK haven't really been in the business long enough to have those many years of data. So we've seen data, going back to 2002. And so I'm interested in the timeline of when graphic warnings were put in place and whether or not packages were stored behind the counter so that customers couldn't see them, and when did that take place? And then when was the plain packaging implemented in Australia?
So plain packaging was implemented in 2010, December. There was a phase-in period from September, if I recall correctly. It was about a 3-month phase-in period. And the national Household Drug Strategy survey is conducted every 3 years.
The data came out in 2013 and then most recently for 2016. There was a big drop between 2010 and 2013, which was very much associated, or in the public debate, was associated with the introduction of plain packaging, but there would have been a 1 month overlap between those periods. But certainly the 2016 decline in smoking prevalence stalled, and it moved from 12.8% to 12.2%, which is not statistically significant. And given population growth, the number of smokers in Australia actually had increased. In terms of policies that have been introduced, graphic health warnings were introduced in Australia in 2006. And as a public health exercise and as a public information exercise, that's quite valuable. Packets are stored behind the counter and in a case, so you can't actually see them ever, and they must be transported from the storeroom to the counter in a bag, so you can't see them either being transported through the store. And that was introduced in 2011, if I recall correctly. There was a 25% increase in tobacco excise in 2010, and that probably drove the change in that we saw between 2010 and 2013. But certainly the decline in prevalence, which is a long-running thing from the early 1990s, stalled. At the same time, if you look at the UK, over that same time period, vaping became quite popular there, and the tobacco cigarette prevalence declined quite precipitously. So, there's all sorts of things going on here, but certainly my critique of the evidence, the data from the National Drug Strategy Survey, the data from the Australian Intelligence Wastewater Survey kind of indicates that plain packaging in and of itself is not having the desired effect. Certainly the plain packaging concept itself, where the idea is that you enhance the noticeability of the graphic warnings, in my opinion, that has failed.
Doctor, do you have any studies demonstrating the price elasticity of cigarette sales?
I haven't done those studies myself, no. But what has happened in Australia is that the market share of cheap cigarettes, what we call cheapies, has increased quite dramatically. So data that I have been able to hunt down showed that the price, that the share of the market for cheapies increased 135%. So smokers are now going into a store and saying, give me your cheaper cigarette. And that's what they're buying, because the medical evidence shows that smokers can't really tell the difference between one brand of cigarette and another brand. When I tell that to smokers, they deny it vehemently, but they say they can, but there seems there's no real evidence. But so people are substituting from legal cigarettes to illegal cigarettes, and from expensive cigarettes to cheaper cigarettes. And that's probably in a combination of the removal of branding and, of course, the increase in the size of the illegal market.
Okay, thanks very much. And now we go to Mr. Davies.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all the witnesses. I know that the tobacco industry and its allies coming before the Health Committee is not the easiest place to come, and I do want to thank you for being here. I find myself wondering if we're dancing around trying to prove that water is wet. I mean, I'm sitting here holding up a small little package with a thin little cigarette that's got purple Vogue and a little purple dot on it, and I'm actually listening to people tell me that they don't think that marketing or how a product looks makes it more attractive to a consumer. I mean, I just think that's ludicrous. I mean, there's not a single Canadian that would believe that, right? Millions, maybe billions of dollars are spent every year on marketing, sophisticated marketing, to make a product more attractive to a person. And really what this legislation is about taking that out of a product that is a addictive carcinogen. And, I don't think I need any studies to know that if we make these cigarette packages less attractive, if we make the health warnings more prominent, if we make if we take out lifestyle advertising that suggests to any user that smoking cigarettes is sophisticated or cool or will help with weight loss or makes you you know, in any way is attractive, that will have over the long term a dampening effect on tobacco use. Now, does anybody here disagree with what I just said?
If I could add to that, though.
Yes, and
there was a very unfortunate byproduct of some of the graphic health warnings here in Australia, where some of the warnings were along the lines of smoking makes your baby smaller. And there was a sociologist, I think, at the Australian National University who discovered that a lot of pregnant young women started smoking for the sole purpose of actually having a smaller baby to avoid pain in childbirth. So I think we also need to think carefully about the unintended consequences of what seems on paper to be a good idea.
Yeah. By the way, Dr. Gibbs, I'm sorry, I do have to ask this because you're a professor. Have you ever received any funding from the tobacco industry or any related tobacco affiliate for any of your research at any time?
No, I have not. My university has a ban on tobacco funding. We've also had a ban on smoking on our campus for decades. I think the 1990s we actually banned smoking in buildings and in vehicles, long before it became fashionable.
Thank you. That's all I need from you, Professor Davidson. My last question I want to give to Freeze the Youth. This is all about young people here. Why don't I leave the last word to you? I mean, what do you want this committee and Parliament to know about what you want to see with the packaging of tobacco products?
Yeah, well, we know that branding and marketing directly influences youth. And if the industry does not think that packaging influences anything, then we're not sure why they are so vehemently determined to keep that 25% of marketing leeway that they currently have. And so what we would want to see is, indeed, the introduction of plain and standardized packaging to make those health messages readily available. And just to know that some people may argue that even though the packages may be hidden behind power walls and convenience stores or whatnot, they're still exposed in our society and people can still look at them anywhere they go. They're littered in the streets, they're poking out of people's pockets, they're flashed around during smoke breaks. And so we just want to reiterate that we urge this committee and the government to introduce and legislate plain and standardized packaging, but to do it correctly and make sure all the loopholes for any marketing or leeway that the industry could have are closed and secured forever.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we go to Ms. Sidhu for the last questions.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Dr. Davidson. I want to ask about the relationship between the Institute of Public Affairs, to which you have been connected as a senior research fellow, and the tobacco industry. Have the IPA received funding from the tobacco industry?
I read on my tobacco control page that the IPA took funding from the tobacco industry with evidence relating back to 1993. Now, it turns out in 1993 I wasn't even in Australia, so I don't know how this will affect me. The other thing to bear in mind is in 1993, tobacco advertising in Australia wasn't illegal. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the IPA took money from tobacco industry in 1993. I wouldn't be surprised if major newspaper groups took funding from the tobacco industry in 1993. And as a matter of fact, I hope you were shocked to hear that the Australian Labor Party was soliciting fund donations from the tobacco industry as recently as 2011. So if they may very well have taken money from the tobacco industry in the distant past, and to be quite honest, so was everybody. They were a legal industry that were advertising, that were promoting their product. So it's hard to get excited about this.
And my second question is on your recent trip to Canada, where you opposed plain packaging. Yes. Is the case of the Canadian Convenience Store Association sponsors your travel?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, are you there?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Over to John.
Thank you. So I was just wondering, we did see, Dr. Davidson, some quite strong evidence that there was a reduction in youth smoking in Australia with the introduction of plain packaging. Was there also public campaigns to go with the changes in tobacco advertising? Do you remember back to that period?
I don't think that there's specific adverts targeting youth smoking in Australia. I don't recall. The government does run, let me clear, the state governments run anti-tobacco advertising on national television, and they generally speaking focus on older smokers, focusing on health effects. And if you have a look at the rational addiction economics model of smoking, if you want to stop kids from smoking, you work through a price mechanism. And as I said before, there's been massive increases in excise pricing in Australia over the last 8 years. And if you want to stop older Australians from, or I suppose older people from smoking, you would emphasise the health aspect of it. I don't recall there being a specific campaign targeted at youth, but certainly that happens through the schools. So the education system, for example, has a very strong anti-smoking flavour to it in public health classes, in the primary and secondary schooling system. So I've been very surprised to hear that Canadian youth don't know that smoking is bad for them, because certainly Australian youth get that message very clearly from the education system.
Okay, thank you for that. And then to any of the witnesses, so the Canadian Cancer Society suggested 4 changes to S5 dealing with how vapor products were being advertised. So they suggested that the vapor products be limited to advertising or brand preference only, that vapor product lifestyle advertising in bars and in publications be banned as it is with tobacco, that restrictions on the location of permitted incentive promotions be restricted, and greatly strengthening restrictions on the location of vapor product advertising to really match the provisions in the Tobacco Act. Do anybody have any comments to those? Any of you have any strong feelings about the vapor industry and advertising of products, and whether S5 should go further than it does now? I guess I'm looking at Akil or Maxime or Annabelle.
I believe Freeze the Industry would support those recommendations made by the Canadian Cancer Society. Anything we can do to further get the point across that this is dangerous and that friendly shouldn't be deadly, we would support.
Okay, thanks.
That's it. That's time's up. And I want to thank all our guests for their different perspectives they brought to our committee. And we're not anywhere near through this process, but we really appreciate all the different perspectives and the way you've delivered your information and your help to us. And thank you, Dr. Davidson, the invisible witness, for being with us. And
Thank you very much.
with that, I adjourn the meeting.